In the winter of 1990, a 31-year-old man named John O'Brien was working as a professional landscaper in a quiet, normal suburb just outside of the bustling city of Chicago, Illinois. John loved his job, and he spent his spring, summer, and autumn months working outdoors, transforming people's yards, planting beautiful gardens, and laying down fresh sod. But as anyone who has ever lived in Illinois knows, the winters in Chicago can be absolutely brutal. By the time January of 1990 rolled around, the ground was frozen solid, the wind was freezing, and the temperatures had dropped well below zero. Landscaping work had completely dried up for the season, and John was spending most of his days cooped up inside his house, trying to stay warm and dreaming of warmer weather. Eventually, John decided that he could not take the freezing cold anymore. He contacted his close friend David, who was also feeling completely exhausted by the long, dark, and bitterly cold Chicago winter. The two friends began talking about taking a vacation. They did not want to go just anywhere. They wanted to go somewhere incredibly warm, sunny, and beautiful. They wanted a true tropical escape where they could lay on a beach and completely forget about the snow and ice back home. After looking through various travel guides and flight options, the two men decided to book a trip to the beautiful Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. This was a twin island nation located in the southern Caribbean, known for its incredible weather, vibrant culture, and stunning sandy beaches. It seemed like the absolute perfect destination for their tropical getaway. They booked their flights and accommodation quickly, eager to leave as soon as possible. It is believed they boarded their plane and left Chicago on either January 8th or January 9th of 1990. When they landed in Trinidad, the contrast to Chicago was immediate and glorious. The air was warm, humid, and tropical. They stepped off the plane, walked through the airport, and made their way to their hotel. The hotel they had booked was located very close to the airport in Trinidad, which was incredibly convenient. They checked in, went up to their room, dropped their heavy winter luggage, and immediately changed into shorts and t-shirts. They were excited to start their vacation, so they headed straight out to explore the local town. Over the next several days, John and David had an amazing time. They walked through the streets of Trinidad, took in the sights, and sampled some of the delicious local Caribbean food. They decided they also wanted to see the sister island of Tobago, which was known for being even more laid-back and scenic. So, they took a relaxing 4-hour boat ride across the water to Tobago. They spent their days lounging on pristine beaches, swimming in the warm ocean water, and just relaxing. They felt incredibly lucky to be in paradise, while all of their friends and family back in Chicago were freezing in the sub-zero temperatures. By all accounts, their vacation was going exactly to plan. It was the perfect escape. But then, Sunday, the 14th of January, arrived. This was the day before they were scheduled to fly back home to Chicago. On this day, things began to take a very strange and highly concerning turn. John woke up that morning and began complaining of an unnamed health issue. To this day, the exact nature of this health issue has never been made public, so we do not know what symptoms he was experiencing. However, whatever this medical issue was, it was causing John a great deal of discomfort and distress. John decided that he needed to get a very specific medication to treat his condition. He left the hotel room and walked into the local town in Trinidad, searching for a drugstore. He found one, went inside, and asked the pharmacist for the specific medicine. But the pharmacist told him that they did not carry that medication. John did not want to give up, so he walked to another drugstore in a different part of town. But they did not have it either. He went to a third store and then a fourth, but none of the pharmacies in the town carried the medication he desperately felt he needed. With no success, John finally gave up and walked back to the hotel. When he walked into the room and saw David, David could immediately tell that something was seriously wrong with his friend. David would later state that John was not just upset about not being able to find the medication, he seemed to be in a highly distraught and erratic state. Even worse, John was becoming visibly disoriented. It seemed that whatever this unnamed health issue was, it was starting to severely affect his mental state. Because his condition was going untreated, it was manifesting in this highly confused, disoriented, and erratic behavior. David tried his best to calm John down and make him comfortable. He watched his friend closely, trying to decide if he needed to call a local doctor or take John to a hospital in Trinidad. But after a while, John seemed to quiet down a bit. David decided that John was stable enough to get through the night without emergency medical intervention. After all, they had a very early flight the next morning to return to Chicago. David reasoned that once they got back to the United States, John could easily see his own doctor and get the proper medication and treatment he needed. So, the two men decided it was best to just get some sleep. The hotel room was equipped with 2 twin-size beds, one for John and one for David. They turned off the lights, climbed into their respective beds, and quickly fell asleep. About an hour to an hour and a half after David had fallen asleep, he was suddenly and violently shocked awake. He could not breathe. In the pitch-black room, David realized that there was a man standing directly next to his bed, leaning over him. This man had his hands wrapped tightly around David's throat and was violently choking him with incredible force. David was completely terrified. He had no time to process what was happening or who was attacking him. He was in a state of pure panic, fighting for his life in the dark. Using his survival instincts, David began grabbing at the attacker's hands, trying to pry the fingers away from his windpipe. He fought with everything he had, and after a desperate struggle, he managed to gather enough strength to push the attacker's hands off of his neck. But the attacker was not finished. The man reached over to the nightstand, grabbed the heavy bedside lamp, and swung it down with immense force, smashing David directly in the head. The impact was incredibly painful, and the force of the blow knocked David completely out of his bed. He crashed heavily onto the hard floor. Before David could even recover or get to his knees, the attacker jumped down on top of him. The two men began fighting wildly on the floor in the darkness. David was struggling desperately, throwing punches and trying to get this violent intruder off of him. Finally, David managed to get a leverage advantage. He gathered all his strength and kicked the man off of him, sending him stumbling backward. David scrambled to his feet, gasping for air. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering into the room, he looked at his attacker and was completely paralyzed with shock. The person who had just tried to strangle him and beat him with a lamp was none other than his best friend, John. And John was completely naked. He was wearing absolutely no clothes. David stood there, bleeding and bruised, staring at his friend in utter disbelief. He asked John what on earth he was doing and what was wrong. But John did not answer. He did not say a single word. He did not even look like the same person. His eyes were wide and completely blank, and he seemed to be in the middle of a massive, terrifying, psychotic break. Instead of speaking, John suddenly turned around and bolted out of the hotel room. He ran out into the hallway, leaving the door wide open. He did not slow down. He ran down the long hallway, sprinted down the stairs, and burst into the hotel lobby. The hotel staff working at the front desk looked up in complete horror as a naked, wild-eyed man sprinted past them. John ran straight through the front doors of the hotel and vanished into the dark night. John ran down the street, his bare feet pounding against the hard pavement. He was in a state of pure frenzy, running as fast as he could. He ran for several minutes until he finally reached the perimeter of the nearby airport. The airport was heavily fortified with security fences. John did not go toward the main entrance gates. Instead, he ran to the side of the gates where there was a massive, towering chain-link fence. The very top of this fence was lined with thick, coiled barbed wire. Without stopping, John began to climb. Even though he was completely naked, he clawed his way up the metal chain-link fence. He reached the top and had to navigate the sharp, tearing barbs of the wire. He managed to drag his body over the top, likely suffering deep cuts and scratches, and dropped down onto the ground on the other side. But where John landed was not actually the open airport grounds. The airport had a double-fence security system. The two high fences ran parallel to one another, back to back, with a narrow strip of land in between them. This gap was a grassy, isolated no-man's land. It was specifically designed to act as a trap for anyone attempting to scale the outer fence. John was now trapped in this grassy strip. But he was on some kind of unstoppable manic mission. He did not try to climb back out to the street. Instead, he turned around and faced the second fence, the one that stood between him and the actual airport runway and buildings. Once again, John began to climb. He dragged his bare, bleeding body up the second high fence. He pulled himself over the barbed wire at the top and dropped down into the parking lot on the other side. He stood up and immediately began running toward the main airport terminal. But between him and the terminal building was another massive obstacle. It was a giant, towering concrete wall. This wall was smooth and solid with no handholds or footholds. It looked completely impossible to climb, especially for someone who was naked and injured. But John did not hesitate. He ran directly at the concrete wall, somehow managed to find a way to scramble up its smooth surface, and flipped himself over the top. On the other side of this wall was a secure area of the airport, and John landed directly next to a small wooden security guard shack. Inside this shack were 4 airport security guards who were on duty. They heard a loud thud, looked out their window, and were absolutely stunned to see a naked, bleeding man suddenly crash land right next to their building. The 4 security guards immediately opened their door and charged out of the shack to apprehend the intruder and find out what was going on. But as soon as they approached John, John turned on them and attacked. We do not know the exact details of the fight, but John was operating with a kind of manic, superhuman strength. Within moments, he managed to completely overpower all 4 of the trained security guards. Before the dazed guards could recover, John ran over to their 4-wheel drive security vehicle, which was parked right next to the shack. The keys were inside. John jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and slammed his foot on the gas. He roared away from the security shack, leaving the 4 injured guards in his dust. The guards got to their feet and started chasing him on foot, but they had no hope of catching up to the speeding vehicle. John drove wildly around the outside of the main airport building, navigating the secure service roads, and then he drove right out onto the active tarmac. Out on the tarmac, it was a busy night. There were several massive passenger airplanes moving slowly into position, preparing for takeoff. One of those planes was a giant British Airways jet airliner. This massive plane was actually the very next aircraft scheduled to take off. The pilots had already fired up the powerful jet engines, and the plane was sitting at the top of the runway, just waiting for final clearance from the air traffic control tower. John saw the massive airplane, and he steered the security vehicle directly toward it. He drove at high speed, crashing straight into the plane. However, the security vehicle he was driving was relatively small and low to the ground. It was not tall enough to strike the main fuselage or body of the massive British Airways jet. Instead, when John collided with the plane, the small 4-wheel drive vehicle slid right under one of the massive wings and became tightly wedged underneath it. By this time, the entire airport was in a state of high alert. The 4 security guards who had been attacked had radioed for help, and security personnel from all over the airport were streaming out onto the tarmac. They were running and driving toward the British Airways plane, where the wrecked security vehicle was wedged. As the guards and airport staff closed in on the scene, they witnessed something incredibly bizarre and disturbing. They looked through the window of the wrecked vehicle and saw John move from the driver's seat over to the passenger seat. He stood up through the open side of the vehicle. The guards could see that he had a very deep, nasty cut on his shoulder, which was bleeding heavily. John reached up with his hand and touched the underside of the airplane's wing. The wing had been damaged in the crash, and thick black engine oil was leaking out of it, dripping down onto the vehicle. John rubbed his hand in the leaking oil, coating his fingers in the thick black fluid. Then he took his oil-covered fingers and began dabbing and packing the oil directly into the deep, open wound on his shoulder. Before the security guards could reach him, John leaped out of the wrecked vehicle. He hit the ground running, darting away from the approaching guards and disappearing into the shadow of the massive airplane. In the utter chaos of the moment, with sirens blaring, engines roaring, and dozens of people running around the tarmac, the security guards momentarily lost sight of him. He had vanished behind the giant aircraft. The security guards and airport personnel came to a stop about 100 feet away from the plane and the wedged vehicle. They stood there in a defensive line, trying to scan the dark tarmac, completely bewildered by what they were witnessing. They were on their radios calling for local police and medical backup, trying to figure out how to handle this naked, seemingly unstoppable man. Then, suddenly, one of the officers spotted movement about 300 feet away. On the other side of the plane, near one of the airport buildings, John emerged from the shadows. He began sprinting back toward the airplane. He was running directly toward the wall of security guards and airport staff. John was incredibly fast. Before anyone could react or move forward to tackle and apprehend him, he reached the side of the plane. He stopped for a split second. He did not look at the guards. Instead, he looked up at the massive spinning jet engine of the British Airways plane. The engine was turned on, and its giant blades were rotating at an incredibly high speed, creating a massive vacuum of suction. John took a breath, and then he leaped directly into the spinning engine. In an instant, John ceased to exist. The sheer force of the jet engine completely decimated him. It was a horrific and instantaneous end to a bizarre and tragic sequence of events. To this day, no one knows for sure what actually caused John O'Brien's sudden violent rampage. It is widely assumed by investigators and medical professionals that he suffered a severe, acute psychotic episode brought on by whatever unnamed health issue he was experiencing, combined with the stress of not being able to find his medication. Ultimately, his tragic death was officially ruled as a suicide. Now, our second story takes us to the world of extreme sports, and to a place that was built for the world's greatest athletes, but became the site of a tragic and unthinkable disaster. Luge is widely considered to be one of the most dangerous and intense sports in the Winter Olympic Games. The premise of the sport is relatively simple, but incredibly terrifying when you really think about it. One or two athletes, who are known as lugers, lie flat on their backs on a small, heavy sled. They then slide down a steeply pitched, winding track made of solid ice. These ice tracks are highly engineered with steep, banked curves and narrow straights. As the lugers slide down, they have very little control. They steer using subtle movements of their calves and shoulders. The speeds they reach are absolutely mind-blowing. A professional luger can easily reach speeds of 80 miles per hour and sometimes even faster. If anything goes wrong, if they lose control for even a fraction of a second, the resulting crash can be catastrophic, often leading to severe injuries or death. In the year 1986, a state-of-the-art luge track was constructed on a ski hill in Alberta, Canada. This track was built specifically to host the bobsled and luge events for the upcoming 1988 Winter Olympic Games, which were held in Calgary. The entire facility, which included the ski hill, the ski jumps, and the sliding track, was named Canada Olympic Park. After the 1988 Winter Olympics concluded, the park remained open. The local government and athletic associations decided to keep the facilities active so that the public could enjoy them for recreational purposes and so that future athletes would have a place to train. Nearly 30 years later, on the night of the 29th of January 2016, three teenage boys decided they wanted to find some late-night adventure. They drove over to Canada Olympic Park long after the facility had closed for the night. The park was dark and quiet, and there was nobody around. The three boys made their way up the snowy hill, carrying cheap, simple plastic sleds that they had brought with them. They hiked up the slope until they reached a highly restricted area. Standing in front of them was a prominent 6-foot-tall blue chain-link fence. This fence was covered with large, bright warning signs. The signs explicitly told the public to stay back and warned that entering the area was strictly forbidden unless you were authorized personnel. None of these three teenage boys were authorized personnel. However, one of the boys had actually worked at Canada Olympic Park the previous winter. His job had been selling tickets to visitors, so he was very familiar with the layout of the park and knew exactly where the luge track started. The boys stood at the fence and looked past it. Inside the perimeter of the blue fence, they saw a tall flight of stairs. These stairs led up to a wooden structure that looked almost like a cozy log cabin. This building was the starting house for the Olympic luge track. The ice track itself literally began inside this starting house and then fed out through a large opening, winding its way down the steep mountain below. The three boys looked at each other and grinned. They thought it would be incredibly fun and thrilling to ride their plastic sleds down an actual Olympic luge track. So they tossed their plastic sleds over the 6-foot blue fence. Then, one by one, they climbed up and over the fence, ignoring the warning signs. Once they were on the restricted side, they picked up their plastic sleds and walked up the wooden stairs, entering the quiet starting house. Inside, it was cold and dark. They started talking about who would go down first, second, and third. They had actually brought helmets with them, so they buckled them on. They also strapped on headlamps, which allowed them to see the track ahead of them because the powerful lights that normally illuminated the track at night were turned off. One by one, the boys positioned themselves on their plastic sleds and pushed off down the icy track. But as they started sliding, they quickly realized that this was not the high-speed thrill ride they had anticipated. In fact, they were going surprisingly slow. The luge track was designed for professional sleds, which have highly polished steel runners or blades on the bottom. Those blades glide effortlessly over the ice, building massive speed, but these boys were on cheap, flat plastic sleds. The plastic created a lot of friction against the cold ice, and as a result, the boys kept slowing down. In fact, they had to constantly use their feet and hands to push themselves along just to keep moving down the track. Eventually, after a slow, frustrating, and painful journey, all three boys made it to the bottom of the track. They were pretty disappointed. They had expected an adrenaline-fueled rush, but instead they had barely crawled down. But then, they had an idea. They realized that the reason they went so slow was because they did not have enough weight on the light plastic sleds. They figured that if they all got onto one single plastic sled together, their combined weight would create enough momentum to overcome the friction of the ice, and they would go much faster. So, they picked up one of the sleds and marched all the way back up the hill. They climbed the stairs and entered the starting house once again. All three of them squeezed on to the single plastic sled, wrapping their arms and legs around each other. With a heavy push, they launched themselves down the track. And this time, it worked. The added weight of the three boys made a massive difference. They flew down the icy track, picking up incredible speed. They zoomed around the banked curves, feeling the cold wind rushing past their faces. It was an absolute blast. It was exactly the high-speed rush they had been looking for. They enjoyed it so much that they decided to do it a few more times. They hiked back up, loaded up, and slid down again. But after a few runs, they realized they were pushing their luck. They did not want to get caught by security. So they decided to call it a night. They climbed back over the blue fence, got into their car, and snuck out of the park completely undetected. The experience had been so exhilarating that they could not stop talking about it all week. They decided that they had to do it again the following weekend. But this time, they wanted to share the experience with their friends. They recruited 5 more teenage boys, telling them all about how amazing it was to fly down an actual Olympic track at night. On the night of Friday, the 5th of February 2016, which crossed over into the early morning hours of Saturday, February 6th, the group of 8 teenage boys drove to Canada Olympic Park. The 3 boys who had been there the previous weekend led the way. They walked up the dark ski hill, guiding their 5 friends through the snow. They reached the same 6-foot blue fence surrounding the luge starting house. One by one, all 8 boys scaled the blue fence and gathered on the other side. They walked up the stairs and piled into the cold starting house. They had brought 3 plastic sleds with them this time. They began discussing how they should divide themselves up to get the maximum amount of speed. They decided to put 3 boys on the first sled, 3 boys on the second sled, and the remaining 2 boys on the third and final sled. Because the previous weekend's runs had gone so smoothly, the boys had become incredibly overconfident. The 3 original boys told the others that the run was completely safe and that they did not need to worry. As a result, the group decided they did not need to wear helmets. They left their helmets behind. Not only that, but they also decided not to bring any headlamps or flashlights. They thought it would be much more exciting and terrifying to go flying down the winding icy track in complete pitch-black darkness. Shortly after midnight on February 6th, the first group of 3 boys climbed onto the first plastic sled. They positioned themselves tightly, holding on to one another, and pushed off into the dark. At first, everything went exactly to plan. They started picking up speed, sliding smoothly down the first few turns of the track. They were laughing and shouting, feeling the thrill of the icy air. They were going very fast. But what none of these boys knew was that during the week, park staff had put up a safety barrier. Specifically, they had strung a heavy metal chain directly across one of the lower sections of the track. This chain was used to secure a large wooden barrier that kept a specific alternate section of the track in place when it was not in use. As the first sled came flying around a sharp, dark corner at a high rate of speed, the 3 boys had absolutely no warning. In the pitch blackness, they could not see the heavy metal chain stretched across the track. The chain was positioned at approximately neck height for anyone sitting on a sled. The first sled struck the metal chain at full speed. The impact was catastrophic. The chain instantly decapitated and killed the boy sitting at the very front of the sled. He was 17-year-old Evan Caldwell. He died on impact. The other 2 boys on the sled were violently thrown from the vehicle, crashing hard into the icy concrete walls of the track. Both of them were knocked completely unconscious, suffering severe injuries. Back up at the top of the track, inside the starting house, the remaining 5 boys were waiting. They had no idea that a tragedy had just occurred. They could not see down the dark track, and they could not hear anything. The boys on the first sled were either dead or unconscious, so there were no screams or calls for help reaching the top of the hill. The second group of 3 boys waited for what they estimated was a safe amount of time. They wanted to make sure the first sled had reached the bottom and cleared the track. Once they figured enough time had passed, the 3 boys piled onto the second sled and pushed off into the darkness. They went hurtling down the track, picking up speed just like the first group. But as they rounded that same sharp corner near the bottom, they also struck the heavy metal chain. However, by some absolute miracle, the second group of boys hit the chain in a slightly different way. The angle of their sled or the way they were leaning caused them to slip just under the chain as they hit it. but the impact still violently threw all three of them off their sled. They were launched into the air and slammed hard onto the icy track. The boys on the second sled survived, though they were badly battered. The worst injury among them was a badly broken ankle. They scrambled to their feet, completely disoriented and terrified. It was pitch black, and they had no idea what they had just crashed into. They were trying to gather their thoughts and find their friends from the first sled. But before they could figure out what was happening, and before they had a chance to yell up the track to warn the final group, it was already too late. The third and final group, consisting of the last two boys, had already pushed off from the starting house. The boys on the track heard the faint, terrifying sound of a plastic sled whistling down the ice toward them. All they could do was scramble to the side of the track to avoid being hit as the third sled came bombing down the hill at full speed. The final two boys on the third sled rounded the corner in the dark and struck the metal chain at maximum speed. One of the boys on this final sled was 17-year-old Jordan Caldwell. Tragically, Jordan was also struck at neck height by the heavy chain. He was killed instantly. Jordan was the twin brother of Evan Caldwell, the boy on the first sled, who had died just minutes earlier. The other boy on the third sled was thrown violently from the wreckage, suffering incredibly severe, life-threatening injuries. One of the survivors of the initial crash was a boy named Caleb. Case had been on the first sled and had been knocked unconscious when he was thrown. When Caleb finally started to regain consciousness, he found himself lying in a section of the track that was covered by a large protective tarp. At first, Caleb could not see anything and he could not hear anything. He felt completely numb. But he immediately realized that he was struggling to breathe. He felt like there was something physically lodged in his throat, blocking his airway. In reality, his throat had been severely crushed and damaged when he collided with the metal chain. As he lay there gasping for air, his senses slowly began to return. His vision cleared slightly, and he looked up. He saw one of the boys from the second sled kneeling right beside him on the ice. This boy had not been severely injured, and he had placed his hand gently on Caleb's shoulder. He was loudly praying, begging God to let Caleb survive. As Caleb lay there listening to the prayer, his hearing began to improve, and he started to hear another sound nearby. It was the voice of a boy named Mark, who had been on the first sled. Mark was very badly injured, and his face was severely fractured and bleeding. But despite his immense pain, Mark was lying on the ice, softly singing a religious song. He was trying to keep everyone's spirits up, trying to encourage the survivors to hold on and keep fighting to stay alive until help arrived. Then, Caleb heard the faint sound of someone speaking to an emergency dispatcher on a cell phone, calling 911. Shortly after that, Caleb blacked out again. When the paramedics and emergency rescue crews finally arrived at Canada Olympic Park, they made their way up to the restricted track. They found a scene of absolute devastation. The 8 boys were scattered all over the lower section of the ice track, having been thrown in different directions by the violent impacts. But when the paramedics located the bodies of the 2 boys who had died, they discovered something deeply moving. The twin brothers, Evan and Jordan Caldwell, were lying right next to each other on the ice. Even though they had gone down the track in different sleds at different times, they ended up side by side in their final moments. None of the surviving boys had moved them, they had simply landed near one another. For the Caldwell family, the loss of both of their twin sons in a single night was an unfathomable tragedy. The grief was devastating for the entire community. But there was a small, haunting solace in knowing that the twins were together at the very end. The 6 surviving boys eventually recovered from their physical wounds, but they walked away with life-altering brain injuries, physical scars, and a deep, permanent sense of guilt and regret. They knew they were incredibly lucky to be alive, but they would have to carry the memory of that terrible night for the rest of their lives. Our third and final story explores the concept of intelligence and how even the most brilliant minds can make decisions that lead to their own undoing. IQ, which stands for Intelligence Quotient, is a scientific measure of a person's cognitive abilities and intelligence. To find your IQ score, you have to take a highly specialized, standardized test administered by psychologists. The vast majority of the human population, about 68%, will score right around 100 on an IQ test. This is considered to be the average range of human intelligence. A much smaller group of people, who are considered highly gifted, will score somewhere between 130 and 160. And then there is an incredibly tiny fraction of the population that scores above 160. These people belong to the true genius class. To put this into perspective, Albert Einstein, who is widely regarded as one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists in human history, is believed to have had an IQ of around 160. He was right on the cusp of this genius class. But as we will see in this final story, having a genius-level intellect does not protect a person from making an incredibly poor lapse in judgment. In the year 1991, 31-year-old Jackie Kotarek was a woman who seemed to have everything going for her. Jackie was an absolute genius. She had been tested and was found to have an IQ of 170. That meant she was statistically smarter than Albert Einstein. Jackie used her incredible brain to pursue a career in medicine. She graduated with top honors from the prestigious medical school at the University of California, Los Angeles, also known as UCLA. After graduating, she completed her medical residency, which is a rigorous multi-year training program for new doctors, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Cedars-Sinai is widely known as one of the best and most advanced hospitals in the United States. Once she finished her residency, Jackie decided to move slightly north of Los Angeles to the city of Bakersfield, California. There, she opened her very own private medical practice. She quickly built a highly successful business, and she was widely respected by her peers. In addition to running her busy practice, she also became a part-time professor at her alma mater, UCLA, commuting back to Los Angeles to teach the next generation of doctors. By all accounts, Jackie was brilliant, wealthy, and deeply passionate about her work. Her patients absolutely adored her because of her kind demeanor and medical expertise, and her students at UCLA highly respected her lectures. Fast forward 19 years to the year 2010. Jackie was now 49 years old. She was still running her successful medical practice in Bakersfield, still teaching at UCLA, and was highly active in her community. However, her personal life was somewhat complicated. She was in an on-again, off-again romantic relationship with a 58-year-old man named William Moody. While the intimate details of their relationship were kept private, it was clear from local news reports and police statements that Jackie and William had a very volatile relationship. They fought frequently, often breaking up and then getting back together. On the evening of Wednesday, the 25th of August 2010, Jackie went out by herself to a local Mediterranean restaurant in Bakersfield. She sat at the bar and began having some drinks. She stayed at the restaurant for a while, and as the night went on, she became visibly intoxicated. At some point during the night, realizing she had had too much to drink, Jackie used her phone to call a local ride-sharing or taxi service to pick her up and take her home. It seemed like a responsible decision, as she knew she was too drunk to drive her own car. The following morning, Thursday, August 26th, Jackie's medical assistant arrived at the practice in Bakersfield. She opened up the office and waited for Jackie to arrive. But the start of the workday came and went, and Jackie did not show up. This was incredibly unusual for Jackie. She was extremely professional and punctual, and she never missed appointments with her patients without giving advance notice. The assistant became worried and dialed Jackie's cell phone. But the call went straight to voicemail. The assistant waited a bit and tried calling again, but there was still no answer. Feeling that something was wrong, the assistant decided to call Jackie's boyfriend, William Moody. William answered his phone. The assistant asked him if he had seen Jackie, explaining that she had not showed up for work and was not answering her phone. William told the assistant that he had actually seen Jackie the night before. William went on to explain his version of events. He said that on Wednesday night, he was home alone at his house in Bakersfield, which was located not very far from the Mediterranean restaurant where Jackie had been drinking. William said that late that night, he looked out his window and saw Jackie's car pull up and park directly in front of his house. He said he could tell from her body language and the way she was walking that she was highly upset about something. William said he got the strong feeling that she was coming over to start a massive fight with him. William decided that he did not want to deal with a confrontation. So, instead of going to the front door to talk to her, he quietly slipped out the back door of his house. He ran off his property through the back gate, completely avoiding her. William said he walked a few blocks over to a friend's house who lived nearby. He asked his friend if he could spend the night, and his friend agreed. When the medical assistant called William on Thursday morning, William was actually still at his friend's house. He had not yet returned to his own home. He told the assistant that he assumed Jackie had eventually realized he wasn't home and had driven away. However, William told the assistant that he would head back to his house right away to see if Jackie was still there or if there was some indication of where she might have gone. William hung up the phone, left his friend's house, and walked the couple of blocks back to his property. When he turned the corner onto a street, he immediately saw Jackie's car parked right where it had been the night before, sitting directly in front of his house. William knew that his house was completely locked and that Jackie did not have a key. He figured she must be asleep inside the car, waiting for him to return. William walked up to the car, preparing himself for an argument. But when he looked through the glass window, he saw that the car was completely empty. However, when he looked closer, he saw that Jackie's purse, her wallet, and her cell phone were all lying on the passenger seat. This made no sense. Why would she leave all of her personal belongings in an unlocked car and walk away? William turned and looked at his house. He wondered if she had somehow managed to get inside or if she was waiting for him in the backyard. He began walking around the perimeter of his house, calling out Jackie's name. There was no response. When he reached the backyard, he did not see Jackie, but he noticed something strange lying on the ground near his back door. It was a heavy metal shovel. William walked over and looked at his back door. He noticed fresh scrape marks and damage around the door frame and lock. It looked very obvious that someone, presumably Jackie, had tried to use the shovel to pry the back door open to break into the house. But the lock had held, and the attempt had failed. William continued walking around the rest of his property calling out for her, but the yard was completely empty. He decided she must have found another way into the house. He walked to the front door, inserted his key, and unlocked it. He stepped inside, feeling highly anxious, expecting to find Jackie sleeping on his couch or waiting for him. He searched every room, every closet, and the basement. All the windows were tightly locked from the inside, and all the doors were secure. There was absolutely no sign of Jackie and no indication that anyone had been inside the house since he had left the night before. William was completely baffled. Her car was out front, her purse and phone were inside the car, and there was a shovel near the damaged back door, but she was nowhere to be found. He called the medical assistant back and told her what he had found. He suggested that maybe Jackie had gotten frustrated, left her things in the car, and called another ride to go somewhere else. He said he was sure she would turn up soon. But the assistant felt a deep sense of dread. She told William that this was completely unlike Jackie and that they needed to contact the police immediately. William agreed, and they called the Bakersfield Police Department to report Jackie missing. The police began their investigation by going to Jackie's own home, but they found no sign of her. Her neighbors had not seen her. Then the officers went to William's house. They searched Jackie's car, documenting the purse and phone. They looked around the exterior of William's house, noting the shovel and the damaged back door. They also did a brief search of the inside of William's home, but they found nothing unusual. The police interviewed neighbors, friends, and family members, but no one had any information. They told William and the assistant that without any evidence of foul play, they simply had to wait. They suggested that Jackie might just be hiding out somewhere because she was upset and that she would likely return on her own. 2 days passed, and there was still no sign of Jackie. On Friday, William left the country on a pre-planned, pre-arranged vacation. Because the police had found no evidence of foul play and did not consider William a suspect, he was cleared to travel. Before he left, William asked one of his close friends to go over to his house during the weekend to feed his pet fish. On Saturday morning, 48 hours after Jackie had been reported missing, William's friend drove over to the house. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. As soon as he opened the door, he was hit by a horrific, overwhelming odor. It was the unmistakable smell of something decaying. The friend covered his nose and mouth with his shirt, gagging. He began walking through the house, trying to find the source of the terrible smell. He first checked the kitchen, thinking that perhaps some meat had gone bad in the refrigerator or that the trash had been left full, but the kitchen was clean. He checked the pet fish tank, but it was fine. He followed the scent as it grew stronger, leading him into the living room. He realized the smell was strongest near the fireplace. The friend walked over to the fireplace. He knelt down and looked inside the hearth where the logs were placed, but there was nothing there. He tilted his head and looked directly up into the dark chimney flue. About 2 feet up the narrow flue, dangling down in the darkness, were 2 human legs. The friend gasped in horror, ran out of the house, and immediately called the police. When investigators and forensic teams arrived, they confirmed that the body stuck inside the chimney was indeed the missing doctor, Jackie Kotarek. Through a careful reconstruction of the evidence, investigators were able to piece together exactly what had happened on that fateful Wednesday night. After leaving the Mediterranean restaurant, Jackie had decided to drive her car to William's house instead of taking the ride service she had called. When she arrived, William had already slipped out the back. Jackie knocked on the doors and windows, but got no response. Being highly intoxicated and upset, she became determined to get inside. She found a shovel in the yard and tried to pry open the back door, but she was unsuccessful. Then she noticed a permanent ladder or structure attached to the back of the house. Despite being intoxicated, Jackie climbed up the ladder and got onto the roof. She walked over to the brick chimney. There was a protective metal cap over the top of the chimney to keep rain and animals out. Jackie managed to pry this cap off. She then decided to lower herself feet first down into the dark, narrow chimney flue, believing she could slide down into the fireplace and enter the house. But she did not realize how narrow the chimney actually was. The flue was not a uniform shape. It started wider at the top and became much narrower as it descended. At some point during her descent, Jackie became completely and tightly wedged in the brick structure. Her arms were likely pinned above her head or tight against her sides, rendering them completely useless. There was nothing for her hands to grab onto, and there was no ledge for her feet to push against. She was completely trapped in the dark, vertical stone shaft. Because William was not home, her screams for help went completely unheard. And then, a terrifying medical phenomenon occurred. It is known as mechanical or positional asphyxia. Every time Jackie took a deep breath and exhaled to scream, her chest would naturally contract and become slightly smaller. Because of gravity, she would slide a fraction of an inch deeper into the narrowing chimney. When she tried to take her next breath, she found that her chest could not expand back to its original size because the tight brick walls of the chimney acted like a rigid, constricting vice. With every breath she took, she slipped lower and the walls became tighter. Her lung capacity shrank second by second, minute by minute. Eventually, she no longer had the lung capacity or the strength to make a loud sound. She could only utter faint, desperate whispers. We know she was alive for a long time. In fact, on Thursday night, William was inside the house sleeping, completely unaware that his girlfriend was trapped just feet away in the chimney. And on Friday night, nearly 48 hours after she had first entered the chimney, neighbors reported hearing a faint, distant voice crying out for help. But they assumed it was just children playing in a nearby pool, so they did not investigate. Shortly after that, Jackie succumbed to the pressure on her chest and passed away. It took local firefighters over 5 hours of carefully chipping away at the heavy brick chimney to finally recover her body. The medical examiner officially ruled her death an accident caused by positional asphyxia. No charges were ever filed, as it was clear that this was a tragic, self-inflicted accident. It was a devastating end for a woman who possessed a genius-level intellect but made one single fatal error in judgment on a dark California night. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 1988, a waitress living in Central Florida had just started her shift at a local diner. She was standing in the middle of the restaurant, getting ready to take an order, when her heart just started racing like crazy. Now, she hadn't been running around or doing any heavy lifting, so it didn't make any sense at all. Startled by what was happening inside her own chest, she just turned around, walked straight into the staff bathroom, and sat down in a stall. She just wanted to wait for this strange sensation to pass. But as she sat there, her heart just continued to beat like a drum, faster and faster. And then she began to feel a strange tingling sensation in her feet, which started to crawl up into her arms. And it was at that moment that a terrifying thought crossed her mind. She realized she might be having a heart attack. Except she wasn't. Something much, much worse was happening to her. Peggy Carr's life had never been particularly easy. She was born back in 1947 in a very small rural town in Central Florida. Her parents were both deaf and had almost no money, so from a very young age, Peggy had to go to work to help support the family. But the only jobs she could find were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous. She worked overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways, often waitressing there all by herself. But Peggy never once complained about her job prospects. She just took whatever work was available because she knew her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in one of those dangerous environments, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior. She did it to make sure no one would even think about trying to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation among her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with. Peggy didn't take any nonsense from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also had a way of warding off potential romantic partners. A lot of men might have been interested in her, but they were kind of intimidated when they tried to talk to her. Eventually, one man did manage to cut through Peggy's defenses. They fell in love, got married, and they had 3 kids together. And for a while, everything was great. Until it wasn't. The marriage eventually crashed and burned, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was in her mid-30s, a divorced mother of 3 teenage children, and she was working overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was at work or out in public, when she was behind closed doors at home with her kids, they saw the real Peggy. And that side of her was just kind of sad. Life had just been hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she'd kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, they weren't bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset all the time. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, that she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would finally put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Pi R. Carr. Pi, which was his nickname, was a lot like Peggy. He was a recently divorced single father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take nonsense from anyone, and just like Peggy, he had been forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny Central Floridian rural town called Alturas. He was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a lot of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pi, they started dating, and right away, Peggy's kids noticed this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she was all smiles, she was so happy. It seemed like Pi was the knight in shining armor that had come to save the day. And then, just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pi and Peggy got married, much to their children's excitement. After the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pi and his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly. Even though they were all living in a fairly small house and all 5 teenagers were kind of on top of each other, they all got along great. It was kind of fun and chaotic to have so many people in the house all the time. The house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in, Peggy and Pi started to have serious marital issues. It was like all their early chemistry had just completely vanished. And in its place was nothing but resentment. They basically couldn't stand each other, and everything one of them did seemed to upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows everybody else's business. The rumor was that Pi was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an affair. Pi denied these accusations, but Peggy totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse. The more they fought, the more a wedge was driven down the center of this blended family. Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pi's kids automatically took their dad's side. And so from the outside looking in, it seemed plainly obvious that Pi and Peggy's marriage was not going to last. But before their marriage could officially fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these 2 families together forever. In late October of 1988, about 7 months into Peggy and Pi's now very rocky marriage, Pi suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This wasn't a planned trip. He just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She just said, "Go ahead, enjoy your trip, I'll see you later." And so Pi, he leaves the house, gets in his truck, and drives off. A little while later, Peggy and her daughter Sissy, they both get their things together and head out. They get in Peggy's car and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. So they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, get their aprons on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. And she had not been running around the restaurant, she had not done any heavy lifting. There was absolutely no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. Initially, Peggy just tried to ignore it. She thought maybe it was just a fluke, that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom. She went into one of the stalls, she shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. So as she's sitting there feeling these strange symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe, just maybe, she was having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she splashes some cold water on her face. She kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom. She goes right into the staff break room and she finds her daughter. She tells her, "I think I'm having a heart attack. But don't worry. I'm just gonna go home. I'm gonna lie down, and if this gets worse, I will go to the hospital. But for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I want to take it seriously. So I'm gonna leave for the day. Her daughter, Sissy, is looking at her mom, really concerned. But Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person who would try to sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back. And please call me if anything changes. And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and whose arms and legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's going to be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving for the day. Peggy slipped out the back door, she got in her car, and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty. So she just went inside, made her way to her bedroom, and she lay down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school. And when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne. His mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a single time ever that he saw his mom napping, not even when she was sick. And so, concerned, he went into her bedroom. She was facing away from him, so he kind of gently jostled her awake. And when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale, she was sweating. She obviously had not been sleeping. She was gritting her teeth, and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of extreme discomfort. And he said, "Mom, geez, are you okay?" And she would say to him, "Oh no, I'm fine. I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on, I think I have a flu or something, I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off." And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails. And if she says she's going to sleep something off, then she'll probably be just fine. So Dwayne said, "Okay, well, let me know if you need anything." And so Dwayne began to walk away. But his mother would actually call him back, and she would level with him. She would tell him that actually something is really wrong here. She said she felt like someone had poured fire down her veins, in her arms and in her legs, and that it was excruciatingly painful. And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight, no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really, really serious. So Dwayne began telling his mom that she had to go to the hospital. He said, "We need to get Pi here to drive you, or we need to call an ambulance, but something needs to be done here." But despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit hesitant about it. She thought maybe she could still just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi returned from his hunting trip. He came into the house, and right away, Dwayne ran over to him. He explained to Pi, "Hey, this is not normal. My mom never, ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You gotta take her to the hospital." But Pi would actually say, "She's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. Man, she'll sleep it off." But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, "Okay, I'll take her to the hospital." And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck, he drove her to the hospital, and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under a doctor's care, she could no longer talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs. Her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, and she was vomiting. I mean, she was really spiraling, and quickly. And so after she was admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and the other family members that had gathered, and they asked them, "Do you have any idea what could have caused this?" And they all said no. She just suddenly started feeling this way. So the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy anything because she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or the test just came back saying that everything was normal. So they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart, yet none of their tests revealed anything was wrong with her. And so they were at a complete loss. They didn't know what was wrong with her. And so, without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room and began monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms started to come down. While she wasn't back completely to her old self, she was able to speak again, she was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable, her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities, but overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. Peggy and her family drove back to their home, and initially, everything was okay. It seemed like she was on the mend. But within 24 hours, Peggy's heart started to race again. And before long, her arms and legs felt like they were on fire all over again. Now, Peggy and her family, they knew that the doctors didn't know what this condition was, and so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy was again suffering from this horrible thing. But going back to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to stay at the house and try to wait it out the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse. It got to the point where she was literally completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital. And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before. So they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive or just showed that nothing was physically wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what was causing all of this. But those tests as well came back negative. And so, totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then, the next morning, the whole situation got even worse. Not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son Dwayne and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting the same symptoms as Peggy. Their hearts were racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through. And they all came back negative, or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition. And suddenly, it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in. He remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. So he told his colleagues, and they ran out, and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy. And sure enough, the next day, the results came back. And all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who, despite being on all these painkillers, was still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her that she was going to die. The only thing they could do was try to make her as comfortable as possible and then try to save her boys. Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma. And then, 4 months later, on the 3rd of March 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. And at that point, she passed away. As for her 2 boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point, everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense at all. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. There is an international organization called Mensa. It's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra-intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived in, Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, what that meant was the chapter would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location, like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role-play a murder investigation. 1 or 2 of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and a subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to each of the real Mensa members. So once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then, once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. So this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away, so this is sometime in April of 1989, a new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with 2 very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter. And they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Treppel. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida. And George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Deanna and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself, she's moved to a brand new area, she's run away from an abusive husband. It's no wonder she wants friends. She probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could. And George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could. He was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with this very elaborate murder scene. And then, between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so, a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costumes, they packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. So they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards, they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character. And everyone's also looking at the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with that he was also very proud about. And he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. She would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme. But in a way, it was kind of flattering for George, because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body and, how you can get it and what the history of this weapon was. And the whole time, Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. So that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great, and they would head home. And then, over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida, and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But, as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry. And so they said, you know what, that's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months, and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not. And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their house key to Sherry and told her, hey, if you need anything, just give us a call. And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car. And as soon as they had driven off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things, she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry, and within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family. A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen. And they set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They just figured somebody else in the family had bought them and left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. So before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody else. Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time around, the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning, and one of the key symptoms was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning. But the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys were lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs, way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her, there's nothing we can do, your body is basically already dead, you're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family had been poisoned. And so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation. And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick. And so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium? And then also, there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really add up. And so Pi would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day, and there was this typed out note that said their family needed to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or they were all going to die. But Pi thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police had ruled Pi out as a suspect, they didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Gorick, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her into the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friend and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pi. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pi, and their kids. They hated them. They thought they were obnoxious, they were too noisy, they were annoying. And so Diana, who for context was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than doctor. She had gotten into at least 1 or 2 serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pi and their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pi, they're not putting up with that. They just told her to get out of here. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy and Pi and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pi and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pi reads it, nothing happens. They don't leave Florida within 2 weeks. And so George went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth. And one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills and he whipped up some thallium and he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle capping machine to put tops back on top of each of them. George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a capping machine at his house. And so, with his 8 deadly drinks, all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pi and her family were out of their house, and then he snuck over and he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on a kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook, and then he left the house. And that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend. The murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors. And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning, and how did you learn about poisoning, and what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was. I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their things were still in the house, including George's things. And so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched George and Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house, they searched it top to bottom, and in the garage, they found George's chemistry equipment. And nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive, and he is still on death row. As for his wife Diana, who many people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning, or must have at least known it was happening, was never actually charged with anything. And so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry. Some cases end with answers. Others end with more questions than anyone can ever fully explain. If you enjoyed this episode, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget, you can find more true crime stories like this in the playlist waiting for you right now. See you in the next story. It was around 10 in the morning on the 18th of March, 1944. A 26-year-old Finnish soldier named Imo Koivunen was sitting around a small campfire with the other men in his squadron. They were deep inside the Arctic Circle, in a dense forest in northern Europe that was buried under several feet of snow. The air was frigid, hovering around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Amo was carefully melting a pot of snow over the flames so the group could have some hot tea. And even though it was a quiet moment, Amo's entire body was aching. This was the first time he and the other soldiers had stopped to rest in nearly 2 full days. They had been on the move constantly, and the exhaustion was setting in deep. Amo and his squadron were part of the Finnish military. At this point in World War II, Finland found itself in a complicated alliance with Nazi Germany. It wasn't because they shared an ideology. It was because they shared a powerful enemy, the Soviet Union. Right now, Amo's group was in a region called Lapland. This area had once belonged to Finland, but 4 years earlier, the Soviets had invaded and forced Finland to give up the territory. Now, with the larger war raging, Finland saw a chance to reclaim their land, and Germany was helping them do it. So Amo and his squadron were on what was basically a reconnaissance mission. Their job was to ski through this part of Lapland and find out what the Soviets were up to, how many of them were out there, and where they were based. For the past 2 days, they had skied all over their designated area of operations. But so far, they hadn't seen a single Soviet soldier. Not one. They hadn't found any Soviet bases either. And for Amo, and probably for the other men with him, this was a good thing. They were all trained for combat, of course, but that didn't mean they were eager to get into a firefight. The Soviet military was bigger, better equipped, and more advanced. If it came down to a real battle out here in the middle of nowhere, there was no telling how it would end. So, as Amo sat there, sore and tired, watching the snow slowly turn to water, he felt a sense of relief. He was grateful that their mission had turned out to be so quiet and uneventful. But then, just as the water in the pot began to boil, the calm was shattered. The unmistakable sound of machine gun fire erupted from somewhere very close by. Instantly, Amo and the others jumped to their feet. They dropped what they were doing and frantically scanned the trees, trying to pinpoint where the shooting was coming from. Before they could even get their bearings, Amo's lieutenant started shouting orders, telling them to grab their weapons and get ready. They all scrambled for their guns. Amo snatched his rifle, and as he looked up, he saw them. Off in the distance, maybe a quarter of a mile away, an entire pack of Soviet soldiers was bearing down on them. They were on skis, gliding down a nearby mountainside, and their machine guns were blazing. They weren't firing warning shots. They were firing directly at Amo and his men. There was no question about it. They were under attack. Now, Amo and the other Finnish soldiers had been trained for exactly this kind of situation. This was their job. They were soldiers. But for a brief moment, as Amo saw the sheer number of Soviet troops descending on their small group, a wave of pure terror washed over him. They were hopelessly outnumbered. He knew, in that instant, that this was going to end badly. His mind flashed to his family. He was the oldest of 6 children. When he had first enlisted, he had made a promise to all his younger siblings. He told them he wouldn't get hurt. He promised he would come home safe. And now, looking at the scene unfolding in front of him, he was certain he was about to break that promise. He was going to die out here in the snow. He glanced over at his lieutenant, who looked just as terrified as he felt. But the officer quickly composed himself. He barked out the only order that made sense: flee. Just moments later, Amo and his men were on their skis, pushing off as hard as they could, skiing away from the Soviets down the other side of the mountain. It was a desperate race for survival. As Amo skied, he could hear the distinct sound of bullets whizzing past his head. He heard them thudding into the trees all around him. He just kept thinking, at any second, one of those bullets is going to find me, or one of my friends. There was nothing they could do but just go. Go as fast and as far as they possibly could. Amo was a strong skier, and he found himself at the front of their fleeing formation. He was leading the pack. This meant it was his job to cut the first tracks through the deep, fresh snow, making it a little easier for the soldiers behind him to follow. But it was incredibly draining work. He was expending a huge amount of energy plowing a path while being shot at. As much as he wanted to stay in the lead and help his teammates, his body was starting to fail him. The initial adrenaline rush you get in a combat situation is unbelievably intense, but it can also lead to a massive crash. It was like his body had burned through all its fuel at once. He had this huge burst of energy, and now he felt like he was collapsing even as the danger was getting closer. His body just couldn't go any faster. He felt himself slowing down. His teammates started zipping past him. They couldn't stop for him. They couldn't even slow down. The bullets were flying. Their only hope was to keep moving. Amo knew that if he couldn't keep up, he was dead. But his muscles were screaming. He was slowing down more and more. The sound of the gunfire was getting louder, closer. He thought about his siblings again, about how devastated they would be when they got the news that he had been killed. Slower and slower he went. The last of his teammates passed him, disappearing down the mountain into a white abyss. And then he was alone. Finally, he lost control of his skis completely. He veered off to the side, started tumbling down the mountain, and smashed hard into a tree. Everything went black. When Amo woke up, it was light outside. He had no idea how much time had passed. He also had no idea how he was still alive. Did the Soviets just miss him? Did they decide not to finish him off? What happened to his teammates? He had so many questions. But alongside the confusion, he felt something else, something very distinct. He had this immense sense of alertness. He was hyper-alert, more aware than he had ever been in his entire life. It was as if his senses were dialed up to 10. He could hear every rustle of the wind, see every detail in the snow around him. He felt totally, completely aware of his surroundings. With this newfound hypervigilance, he started to take stock of his situation. The first thing he noticed was that he was alone. The Soviets were gone. He wasn't a prisoner. His comrades were also nowhere to be seen. He was completely alone in the wilderness of the Arctic Circle.
but then he saw his skis lying nearby. He still had his boots on. Most of his equipment was scattered around him, but it was there. He even found his compass, which he had been holding in his hand. He still had a way to navigate, and he still had his rifle. He thought to himself, okay, the situation is bad, but I have the tools I need to survive for a while. And then he realized something truly amazing. Despite having crashed and smashed into a tree, he didn't feel any pain. He checked his body over. He didn't seem to have any injuries at all. It felt like a miracle. The worst thing that had happened was that he was lost and abandoned. But it could have been so much worse. Amo eventually pushed himself up to his feet. He looked off into the distance, and there, maybe 6 or 7 miles away, he saw a plume of smoke rising from a mountain. He recognized that mountain immediately. It was the designated rendezvous point for his squadron, the place they were supposed to go if they ever got separated. Hope surged through him. He looked at the smoke, a clear sign of life, and thought, that's them. Those are my teammates. They made it to the rendezvous point. All I have to do is get to that mountain. So, Amo gathered his backpack, picked up his gun, and put on his skis. He started skiing towards the distant mountain. For a long time, he just kept his eyes locked on that column of smoke, making sure he was heading in the right direction. As he got closer, he became more and more certain. In addition to the smoke, he could now make out what looked like small lean-to tents on the mountainside. That was a telltale sign. That's how Finnish soldiers set up their camps. This was it. He was going to be saved. He just had to get there. And he felt this incredible surge of energy. Maybe it was the relief of knowing he was close to being rescued, but it felt like nothing could make him tired. Finally, Amo got close enough to the campsite that he could actually see faces. He could see the other soldiers. And they were his comrades. They were Finnish soldiers. They had made it to the rendezvous point, just as he had hoped. They hadn't seen him yet. So here he was, full of energy, barreling towards them on his skis. He started calling out. He figured they would be shocked to see anyone just emerge from the wilderness, let alone him, Amo, who they must have assumed was dead by now. He also didn't want them to mistake him for a Soviet soldier and open fire. So he shouted their names, trying to get their attention. At some point, one of the men on the mountain turned and saw him. But his reaction was not what Amo expected. The soldier looked shocked. Then he grabbed his weapon and started shooting at him. Before Amo could process what was happening, all the other soldiers, all of his comrades, were opening fire on him too. He couldn't believe it. He was yelling, "It's me! It's Amo!" But they kept shooting. He was already skiing so fast that the only thing he could do was continue his momentum. He skied right through the middle of their camp down the other side of the mountain, just trying to get away. Bullets were whizzing past his head again. Miraculously, none of them hit him. He was thinking, they think I'm a Soviet. How can they not recognize me? He had barreled right past them. After he was a good distance away from the campsite, he stopped and yelled back, "Guys, it's me!" "What are you doing?" But they were still yelling and shooting in his direction. He had no choice but to keep skiing away from them, away from the safety he thought he had found. He went on for hours, just skiing and skiing. The whole time his mind was racing. What had just happened? Even if they thought he was an enemy at first, wouldn't they have realized their mistake as he skied right through their camp? He was wearing the same uniform. He had the same weapon. Some of them must have recognized his face. It made no sense. And he was also wondering, how do I have so much energy? How am I able to do this? He had been skiing for hours and hours, had been shot at twice, had crashed into a tree. It all felt completely surreal. Amo just kept skiing until it was abundantly clear he was out of shooting range. He couldn't hear any more gunfire. He was safe again, but still deeply confused. The sun had gone down, and he knew he should stop. He needed to make a camp, regroup, and figure things out. But as he stood there in the dark, he had a strange realization. He hadn't eaten anything. He hadn't had a drop of water. He had basically been skiing at a full sprint for almost the entire day. He'd had multiple near-death experiences. But he felt great. He felt like he had more energy than he'd ever had in his life. He was baffled. Is this what a true survival situation does to you? Does your body just go into some kind of overdrive? He couldn't understand it. He stood there, literally telling himself, you need to stop. Even though you feel like you could go on forever, you need to stop. You need a fire. You need food and water. You need to rest. It felt like he was forcing himself to do these things. He had no natural urge to do them. It was like his body had forgotten the basic human needs. So, he did it. He stopped. He built a fire. He made some food. He wasn't hungry at all, but he forced himself to eat. He drank some water. Then he told himself, okay, now I'll rest. And in the morning, I'll figure out what to do next. He lay down in the snow to go to sleep. He should have been completely and utterly exhausted. But he wasn't. He couldn't sleep at all. He just lay there wide awake as the wind and snow whipped around him. He felt great, but not the least bit tired. The next morning, the sun came up, and Amo hadn't slept for a single minute. But still, he felt fine. He got up, put his skis on, gathered his things, and continued skiing in the direction he believed would eventually lead him back to Finland. As he moved, he thought about how strange his situation was. When the Soviets first attacked, his mind had been clear, but his body had failed him. His legs had gotten so tired from breaking the trail that he crashed. But now, it was the complete opposite. His mind felt delirious. He couldn't keep his thoughts straight. But his body was like a machine. It just kept going, no matter what. He skied almost without thinking, his body on some kind of autopilot. He skied for hours and hours, just pushing forward in one direction. The whole time, he didn't see another person. He was truly out in the middle of the Arctic Circle. No more Soviets, no more teammates. Just him and the endless snow. He didn't even know if he was going in the right direction, but he had to do something. He just had to keep going. That night, as he was still skiing in a straight line, not stopping, he saw something unbelievable. Up ahead, there was a person. It was the first person he had seen since the ambush at the campsite. And what was even more unbelievable was that he recognized the person. It was one of his teammates, a man named Matty. They had been together when the Soviets first attacked. Amo was flooded with relief. Matty must have gotten separated too. It was a miracle that they had found each other. Amo skied right up to Matty, waving him down. He was so happy to see a friendly face. Matty looked over at him, and thankfully, he didn't shoot. Instead, he put a finger to his lips, telling Amo to be quiet. He then beckoned him over. When Amo got next to him, he had a million questions. What do we do now? Where are we going? But Matty just told him again to be quiet, and then he gestured for them to lie down on the ground. Amo didn't understand what was going on, but he trusted Matty. He wasn't being shot at, which was a good sign. So, the two of them just lay down together in the snow. And for the first time in what felt like a very long time, Amo felt tired. He closed his eyes, and he drifted off to sleep almost immediately. When Amo woke up again, he was not lying in the snow with Matty. He was standing up on his skis, moving down a mountain at a steady pace, as if he were on a mission. Matty was nowhere to be found. And on top of that, Amo realized he didn't have his backpack anymore. And he didn't have his gun. He had no idea how long he'd been skiing for or where he was going. It was as if he had magically gone from being passed out in the snow to being in the middle of skiing. At this point, Amo knew something was seriously wrong with his mind. He told himself, I must be hallucinating. How else could I have been with Matty 1 second and now I'm here? It just didn't add up. As he continued to ski mindlessly along, he started to accept his fate. He thought, this is what dying feels like. You lose your mind before your body gives out. His mind was all over the place, but his body was still going at full tilt, full of that unexplainable energy. He knew that at some point that energy was going to run out, and then he would just die. That's what was going to happen. Amo's only hope was that between now and then, maybe, just maybe, someone would find him and save him. He knew it was a long shot, but it was all he had left. And so he skied on. No weapon, no backpack, no supplies. He was operating on no sleep, and he was just skiing. For days and days, he didn't stop. He couldn't believe his body was holding up. His mind was gone, but he just kept going. He didn't run into anyone. But then one day, days later, as he was skiing along, something appeared in front of him, almost like a mirage. It was a building. He couldn't tell if it was a military outpost or a civilian building. He didn't know if it was Finnish or German or Soviet. But even in his fractured mental state, he knew he had to make a choice. He could try to get to that building and hope that whoever was inside would help him. Even if they killed him, it was a better option than what he was doing now, which was just an endless ski towards his own death. So Amo started skiing faster and faster towards the building with a kind of reckless abandon. He was fully committed. This was either his rescue or his end. As he got closer, he saw that it was a military installation. And unbelievably, it was a German military installation. At this point in the war, the Finns were allied with the Germans. This was a safe place. He was so relieved he could have cried. He couldn't believe he might actually survive this. He kicked off his skis and started running towards the front door of the building. But before he could get there, he stepped on something. There was a loud bang. He was thrown into the air and came crashing back down onto the snow. When Amo opened his eyes, he took stock of what had just happened. He still didn't feel any pain, but when he looked down, he saw that his foot was a bloody mess. There were literally bones poking out of his ankle. He had clearly stepped on a landmine. But Amo was determined to get into that building. He pulled himself up, channeling that unbelievable endurance he'd been feeling for days. He stood up on his one good foot and started hobbling his way towards the door. He finally made it to the front of the German military base. He reached out, grabbed the doorknob, and was just about to open it when there was another loud bang. He was thrown into the air again. He had stepped on a second landmine. He came smashing down, but he still didn't die. He still felt no pain. But when he looked down at his legs, he saw that his other leg, the one that had been uninjured just a minute ago, was now also mangled. Now he couldn't even stand. He was completely incapacitated. And to make matters worse, as he looked more closely at the building, he realized it was abandoned. There was no one here. This wasn't going to save him. He was trapped. At this point, Amo just gave up. He said to himself, "You know what? It's over. I'm going to die." He crawled over to a nearby ditch and let himself roll into it. And he just waited to die. He knew it was over. But for days, he didn't die. He just lay there in the ditch, wanting it to be over. What else could he do? Who was going to save him now? He just watched the sun come up and go down over and over again. He lost track of how many days he was lying there, bleeding profusely from his grievous injuries. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't had water. He couldn't believe he was still alive. Then one day, as he was lying in the ditch, he looked up and saw what looked like a plane flying overhead. He was in such bad shape that he didn't know if he was hallucinating again. But he felt like this one was real. After watching the plane circle for a minute, Amo was almost certain he heard the sound of it landing nearby. A few minutes later, from his position in the ditch, he could have sworn he heard people speaking in Finnish, his native language. He still didn't know if it was real, but then a head poked over the top of the ditch. It was a young Finnish man, looking down at him. Amo looked back up at him. And a second later, he was being pulled out of the ditch. Later that day, Amo found himself lying in a hospital bed in Finland. The man, the plane, the rescue, it was all real. He had been saved. At the hospital, the doctors and nurses were shocked by his condition. He weighed just 94 pounds. He was badly burned and frostbitten. Both of his legs were horribly mangled. And his heart was beating at a staggering 200 beats per minute, even though he was just lying in bed. Even crazier, they couldn't get his heart to slow down. It just kept racing at that impossibly high level. The staff couldn't understand how he was even alive. A heart can't beat that fast for that long without giving out. But after they spoke to Amo and he recounted the whole unbelievable ordeal, they learned one specific detail that explained everything. Back when Amo and his comrades were first ambushed, he was struggling to keep up. He was exhausted and falling behind, and he was terrified of being captured or killed by the Soviets. So, in a moment of desperation, before he crashed, he tried something. He pulled out a special military ration he had been issued. It was a stimulant designed to give soldiers a burst of energy in extreme situations. He took it, thinking it would give him the boost he needed to escape with his teammates. But the ration didn't seem to work immediately. He was still so tired that he crashed and passed out. However, when Amo woke up, the drug had kicked in. That's why he felt so hyper-alert, why he had so much energy. It's what allowed him to ski for days without food, water, or sleep. It's why he didn't feel any pain when he was blown up by 2 landmines. It's why his body refused to die, even as he lay bleeding in a ditch for a week. These rations had done their job. They had given him more than enough energy to survive for 2 crazy weeks in the wild. The military ration was a drug called Pervitin. And the thing about Pervitin is that it's just pure methamphetamine. In essence, Amo Koivunen survived in the wild for 2 weeks because he was on a meth-fueled rampage. He was completely high the entire time, and it saved his life. But Pervitin has 2 very distinct downsides. 1, it's incredibly addictive. And 2, it causes extremely intense and vivid hallucinations. So, it's very likely that Amo never actually came across his own battalion, and they never opened fire on him. He probably never met his teammate Maddie out in the wilderness. We're not even sure if the German military installation he saw was real. It's very likely that all of it was just a product of his mind, a powerful hallucination brought on by the drug. The landmines, however, those were very real. Somewhat unbelievably, Amo would go on to make a full recovery. He got married, he had 9 children, and he lived to the age of 71. And as grateful as he was to the drug that saved his life, he never took Pervitin again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We begin this story in the quiet, peaceful province of Quebec, Canada, where 2 young sisters were preparing for the adventure of a lifetime. Noemi Belliner was 25 years old, and her younger sister, Audrey, was 20. They grew up in a very close and loving household, raised by parents who supported them in everything they did. Noemi and Audrey were not just sisters, they were absolute best friends who did almost everything together. Noemi was the older, more practical sister. She was currently in college, studying hard, keeping her life organized, and always making sure she looked out for those around her. She was majoring in a demanding field that required hours of reading, writing, research papers, and preparing for difficult exams. Audrey was 20, also a college student, but she was the free spirit of the family. She was energetic, full of laughter, and had an adventurous soul that was always ready for something new. Both girls had worked incredibly hard throughout the school year, balancing their heavy course loads with part-time jobs to save up money. They had dreamed of taking a massive month-long vacation to celebrate the end of the school year and the successful completion of their exams. They saved every dollar they could, planning their itinerary down to the smallest detail, and finally, their dream was about to become a reality. Their parents, naturally, were deeply anxious about their 2 young daughters traveling thousands of miles away in foreign countries on their own. They worried about their safety, the language barrier, the unfamiliar environments, and any potential dangers they might encounter. To ease their minds, Noemi had made a firm promise before they left Canada. She told her parents that she would act as the protective big sister, keeping a constant eye on Audrey and making sure they stayed safe. Audrey had promised to listen to Noemi and follow her advice. Every single day, without fail, Noemi would send a text message or make a quick phone call to her parents to share photos and let them know they were safe. This daily routine was incredibly important, providing a vital sense of comfort to their worried parents back home. Their big trip was designed to take them across Southeast Asia, a part of the world they had always wanted to see. They started their journey in Vietnam, where they spent 3 incredible weeks traveling from north to south. They walked through the bustling, chaotic streets of Hanoi, took beautiful boat tours through the towering limestone cliffs of Ha Long Bay, and explored the peaceful, historic town of Hoi An. They stayed in busy hostels, met fellow backpackers from all over the world, and tried local street foods like pho and banh mi. It was an amazing experience, and they were having the time of their lives. So while the girls were in Vietnam, they had met these 2 really nice guys who were from Brazil. They had crossed paths in a hostel and had instantly hit it off. They ended up hanging out for several days, exploring the local attractions and sharing laughs. They had become really close, and when the girls left Vietnam, they were sad because they assumed they would never see these guys again. But wouldn't you know it, it turned out those guys, their itinerary, also included them coming to Thailand, and they were arriving on Phi Island on the exact same day. And so it was kind of like this amazing revelation at the end of their time in Vietnam that they would not have to say goodbye basically forever, but instead the good times could keep on rolling in Thailand. And so the plan was that night they would meet up with these 2 Brazilian guys out on the beach and basically party with them and just have a fun night out. After 3 wonderful weeks in Vietnam, it was time to move on to the final part of their vacation, which was Thailand. On June 12, 2012, Noemi and Audrey arrived on Phi Island, which is a major tourist destination in Thailand, famous for its breathtaking white sand beaches, crystal clear turquoise waters, and energetic nightlife. However, getting to the island had been an incredibly grueling process. They had to wake up early, navigate busy airports, board a flight, find ground transportation, and then board a crowded hot ferry to finally reach the island. By the time the ferry docked and they had to carry their heavy suitcases through the humid, tropical heat of the island's narrow streets, both girls were completely exhausted. They finally reached their hotel, checked in at the front desk, and headed down the long hallway to their room. Once the door was unlocked, Noemi pushed it open and she held it for her little sister, 20-year-old Audrey, who came in wheeling all their suitcases behind her. The cool air from the air conditioning hit them immediately, which was a massive relief from the stifling heat outside. The room was clean and nice with 2 separate beds. Noemi, in particular, was feeling really exhausted. I mean, there was a lot of travel getting here today, and the past 3 weeks of constant travel had really taken a toll on her. She was hitting a physical wall, and all she really wanted to do was just flop down on the bed and just lay there for a little while to let her muscles relax. But she had also become a fairly experienced traveler by this point, and she knew before she did that she just wanted to make sure that the bed was clean. She knew how important it was to check for bed bugs, unclean sheets, or any other hidden surprises in hotel rooms. And so she went over to the bed, pulled the pristine sheets back, and carefully inspected the mattress. The sheets were pristine. It was absolutely beautiful. The room felt super nice and clean, and the air conditioning was cooling the room down perfectly. And so, feeling satisfied, she just flopped down on the bed, closed her eyes, and enjoyed the cool air. And at the same time that she was doing this, Audrey, who very likely was also feeling all the symptoms of travel over so many weeks, was acting a bit differently. I mean, she likely was very, very tired as well, but instead of laying down on her bed, she went right into the bathroom and started getting ready for the night. She turned on the shower, laid out her clothes, and began putting on her makeup. And Noemi sort of understood why her sister was in such a rush to get ready. Now, Noemi was looking forward to this night out with these 2 guys, but she also had a little bit of apprehension about it. I mean, these guys were perfectly nice, and she and her sister had spent plenty of time with them in Vietnam, and really things had been fine. But Naomi felt like Audrey was a little bit more naive and sort of like easier to be taken advantage of than she was. Audrey was younger than her by 5 years, and she had a tendency to see only the good in people, sometimes ignoring potential warning signs. And also, when the sisters had gone on this trip, their parents had been really apprehensive about two young women traveling alone together all over the world. They were worried about their safety, and Naomi had promised to protect Audrey. And so Naomi sort of felt like she had a massive, constant responsibility to keep Audrey safe. And so she was feeling a bit apprehensive about whatever they were going to do that night with these guys. It just sort of seemed like things were moving very quickly, and maybe they should have just let the friendship end in Vietnam. But they were here now, and the guys were waiting. And so Naomi, as she is laying there on the bed and Audrey is getting ready, Naomi decides to just give her parents a call. One of the things Naomi had been doing over the past several weeks on this vacation was constantly updating her parents to assuage their concerns that anything was wrong with their two kids. Naomi wanted her parents to see that she was doing everything she could to keep her and her sister safe. And so she pulled out her phone and she was about to call her parents when suddenly Audrey appeared from the bathroom and said, "Stop." And she told her, like, "Hey, remember, it is evening for us, but back home in Canada, it is the middle of the night. You are going to be waking them up in the dead of night, and they are going to have loads of questions like, why are you calling in the middle of the night? And probably you are going to have to tell them about how we are going out tonight with these two guys, and they're going to worry. Like, do not do that. Spare them the worry. We will talk to them tomorrow when they wake up. They do not need to know what we are doing tonight, and everything is going to be fine." And Naomi was thinking, you know what? She is right. This is a bad time to call. Naomi actually forgot how significant the time change was. And she also was not sure what she would say to her parents about going out with these two guys because it would definitely raise some red flags and cause unnecessary panic. And so Naomi put her phone down and decided, you know what? Tonight is going to be just fine, and I just have to let things go. And so she actually climbed off the bed and she joined her sister in the bathroom and began also getting ready for their big night out. A little bit later, Naomi and Audrey left their hotel room and they headed out to the beach. The air was warm and the island was alive with the sound of music, laughter, and the gentle crashing of the waves. And sure enough, there, right outside of a beachfront bar, were the two Brazilian guys they were meeting up with that night. And as the two girls approached, they saw that each of these guys was holding these big buckets. They almost looked like a toy that a child would use on the sand, to fill it up and make a sandcastle with, like a big colorful beach bucket. And the girls, as they were walking over, were wondering what these buckets were for. They thought it was maybe some joke these guys were going to play, or they did not know what. But as they got closer, they realized that these buckets these guys were holding were filled to the brim with ice and liquid. There was some sort of drink inside of these buckets. And so the girls walked up to them and they said, "Hello." And very quickly, the conversation turned to these big drinks they were holding, and Naomi and Audrey were like, "What are those?" And the guys told them, "These are like these amazing cocktails that you can only get in this part of the world." The girls asked, well, what is it? What is inside of the drink and what makes it so special? And the guys kind of looked at each other and laughed, and they were like, "I do not know. Just try it. It is really good and it will make you feel great." Now, Naomi, being the sort of more responsible and cautious one, did not immediately begin drinking either of these drinks. Instead, she sort of paused and thought about it, wondering what kind of ingredients were mixed inside. But Audrey, on the other hand, was totally sold. She reached forward, grabbed one of the buckets, and just began chugging this drink. And so Naomi is looking at her like, "Come on, you cannot just jump into this when we do not even know what this stuff is." But after a couple of big chugs, Audrey lowered the bucket, looked at her sister, and she just grinned. She handed the bucket back to her guy, and then she told Naomi, "This tastes great, this is awesome, you have got to try it, just loosen up." And so at this point, Naomi is considering the situation. They had been in Vietnam with these guys, and these guys had gone out partying with them, drinking with them, and they had seemed perfectly trustworthy and respectful. The guys were clearly drinking from these buckets themselves, and it did not seem like anything nefarious or dangerous was going on. And also, Naomi looked around the beach and suddenly realized that basically everybody had these big buckets. It was not just these two guys. Almost every single tourist on the beach was drinking this exact same thing. And so Naomi is thinking, okay, well, if they think it is okay and it is sort of normal in this part of the world, then it has got to be okay. And so she reached forward, grabbed the other bucket from the other guy, and took a big sip. Several hours later, well after the sun had gone down completely, Audrey and Naomi were having a great time with their Brazilian friends. They were still near this beachfront bar, and they were actually dancing right outside of it because now there was a DJ blaring some upbeat music, and there were all these people gathered around. Actually, the sisters had sort of broken up and were sort of doing their own thing with their respective guy, but they were sort of near enough to each other that they could kind of keep tabs on each other and make sure everything was fine. They were just having a blast. By this point, they had jumped in the ocean and gone swimming in the warm water. They had eaten a ton of local street food from the nearby vendors, and Naomi had lost count of how many of these big bucket drinks they had all consumed together. But they were really just having a blast. I mean, Naomi's vision was a bit blurry, and she was kind of stumbling around on the sand. And she would look over at Audrey, and she was in the exact same state, as were the two guys they were with. I mean, they were buzzed, laughing, and having a great time. And so the two girls and their guys are just out there dancing and doing their thing. It is about 1 a.m. at this point, and Naomi's guy says to her, "Hey, do you want to head back to the hotel room together?" And Naomi is like, "Yeah, let us go back, but hold on, I want to talk to my sister first." And so Naomi kind of stumbles her way over to Audrey, who is in the middle of this big dance routine with her guy, and she stops Audrey. Audrey whips around, and she is all smiles too. And Naomi is like, "Hey, do you want to go back to the hotel room? We are going back now. Do you want to come?" And Audrey's like, "No, I want to stay here. I am having too much fun. This is awesome. We are just going to keep on dancing. You guys should stay too." But Naomi was like, "No, I got to go. We are going to go back. So are you sure you want to stay?" And Audrey was like, "Yeah, we will stay. We will see you at the hotel soon." Now, typically, Naomi and her sister really rarely separated, especially when they were out drinking and partying, because of all the inherent risks of being alone at night, potentially intoxicated in a foreign place. And so this was kind of a rare thing for her to break away from her sister and separate. But it just seemed like this was okay. It felt safe, the beach was well lit, and these guys they were with really seemed like stand-up guys. And again, Audrey was just having an absolute blast, and Naomi did not really want to stop her from having a good time. And so ultimately, she did say bye to her sister and said she would see her soon. Naomi turned, and with her guy, she headed back to the hotel, and Audrey kept on dancing with her guy in front of the beach bar. Let us now move forward 3 days to the evening of June 15th. Over the last 48 hours, the hotel staff had noticed that the Do Not Disturb sign had remained hanging on the doorknob of room 47. No one had been seen entering or leaving the room, and the room had not been cleaned since the girls checked in on June 12th. This was a busy hotel, and the housekeeping staff had a strict schedule to maintain. On this particular evening, a member of the housekeeping staff walked up to the room carrying her cleaning supplies. She knocked firmly on the door, calling out housekeeping, but there was no response. She knocked again, louder this time, but the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning from inside. Assuming the guests were either deeply asleep or had gone out for the day, the housekeeper pulled out her master keycard. She swiped it through the lock, watched the light turn green, and pushed the door open. She stepped into the room, expecting to do a standard cleaning. But within seconds, the housekeeper was running out of the room in absolute horror. She ran down the hallway, screaming for help, her face pale with shock. By 9 o'clock that night, a team of local police officers arrived at the hotel, led by Lieutenant Colonel Rat Sambo. Sambo was an experienced and respected investigator on the island. He had received a brief explanation of what had been discovered, but walking into the room itself was a heavy experience. When Sambo and his team entered room 47, they were met with a tragic and deeply disturbing sight. Noami and Audrey Belliner were lying in their respective beds. They were tucked neatly under their sheets, looking almost as if they were asleep. But they were completely still, and they were not breathing. Each of their beds, along with the floor surrounding them, was covered in vomit. Sambo carefully examined the scene and estimated that both women had been dead for somewhere between 12 and 20 hours. His initial theory was that this was a tragic case of severe alcohol poisoning. Pea Island was known for its intense party scene, and it was unfortunately common for young tourists to overindulge in alcohol, sometimes with fatal consequences. The presence of vomit seemed to align with this theory. But as Sambo looked closer at the girls' bodies, he noticed a highly unusual and confounding detail. There was dried blood visible on the girls' gums, and there was also dried dark blood under their fingernails. This was a critical piece of evidence that did not fit the narrative of alcohol poisoning. Sambo began to wonder if these were defensive wounds. He thought that perhaps someone had broken into the room, attacked the girls, and murdered them. But when he and his team conducted a detailed search of the hotel room, they found absolutely no signs of a struggle. The furniture was in place, the girls' personal belongings were undisturbed, and their money, passports, and electronics were all accounted for. There was no sign of forced entry on the door or windows. If someone had entered the room and harmed them, they had left no physical trace behind. Sambo realized that he could not solve this case without scientific evidence. He needed to wait for the official autopsy and a comprehensive toxicology report to determine the exact cause of death. But those tests would take several days, if not weeks, to process. In the meantime, Sambo decided to focus his efforts on reconstructing the girls' movements in the hours leading up to their deaths. He wanted to know where they had been, what they had consumed, and most importantly, who they had been with. Over the next few days, Sambo's team interviewed the hotel staff and reviewed the building's security camera footage. The cameras provided a clear and undeniable timeline of the night of June 12th. The footage showed Noami returning to the hotel with her Brazilian guy at 1 a.m. They entered the room together. Then, at 4 a.m, Audrey arrived at the hotel with her guy, and they also went into the room. All four of them remained inside the room until 6 a.m, when the security cameras showed both of the Brazilian men walking out of the hotel lobby together. The girls never emerged from the room again. This meant the two Brazilian men were the last people to see Noami and Audrey alive. Sambo knew they were critical to the investigation. The police department immediately issued a public announcement detailing the girls' deaths and calling for any information that could help identify the two men. However, they soon discovered that the men had already checked out of their accommodations and boarded a flight out of Thailand, heading back to Brazil. Since Brazil was far outside of Sambo's jurisdiction, he could not simply fly there to interview them. He had to contact Interpol, the international police organization, and request their assistance in locating and questioning the two men. About a week later, Sambo finally received an update from Interpol. They had successfully located the two Brazilian men and interviewed them about their time with the Canadian sisters. According to the Interpol report, when the men were informed of Noami and Audrey's deaths, they were genuinely shocked and devastated. They explained that their sudden departure from Thailand was not a flight to escape justice, but rather a pre-booked flight that had been scheduled weeks in advance as part of their travel plans. They insisted they had nothing to hide. When questioned about the girls' condition, when they left the room at 6 a.m, the men stated that the sisters seemed a bit hungover and tired, but otherwise completely fine. But then, the men shared a very important detail. They admitted that for the next 2 days after leaving the hotel, they both became violently ill. They suffered from severe vomiting, extreme weakness, and muscle aches that kept them bedridden in their next location. They did not know what had caused it, but they had never felt so sick in their lives. Sambo found this detail incredibly intriguing. If all four of them had become violently ill after that night, perhaps they had all contracted a severe illness or been exposed to a powerful toxin. Sambo began to research common local illnesses and foodborne toxins. He looked into a specific type of wild mushroom found in Thailand, that was known to cause severe, sometimes fatal food poisoning in tourists. He also considered poorly prepared blowfish, which contains tetrodotoxin, a lethal poison. He wondered if the guys had survived the poisoning due to their larger body mass, while the younger, smaller sisters had tragically succumbed. But when the official autopsy and toxicology reports finally arrived from the medical examiner, they shattered the food poisoning theory. The reports revealed that both Noemi and Audrey had ingested a chemical called DE, which is the primary active ingredient used in insect repellents and pesticides. The investigators immediately linked this finding to the popular beachside bucket drinks the girls had consumed. In Thailand, these bucket drinks, known locally as 4x100s, were popular among young backpackers looking for a cheap and intense high. However, the recipe for these drinks was highly illegal and extremely dangerous. They typically contained a mixture of cough syrup, Coca-Cola, crushed narcotics, and sometimes even pesticide, which was added in the belief that it enhanced the effects of the drugs. Sambo concluded that the beach bar where the girls had spent the night had mixed a toxic batch of these 4x100s, accidentally adding a lethal amount of DE to the drink. He believed that the girls had died of accidental pesticide poisoning from the contaminated drinks, while the two Brazilian men had barely survived the toxic dosage. Satisfied with this explanation, the Thai police officially ruled the deaths as an accidental poisoning from a toxic beverage. They closed the case, and 9 days after the tragedy, they sent the sisters' remains back to Canada. But when Noemi and Audrey's bodies arrived in Quebec, the story did not end. Their parents were absolutely devastated by the loss of their daughters, but they were also incredibly angry. They had not been contacted by the Thai police during the investigation and had only learned about the deaths of their children through media reports. They felt the communication was deeply disrespectful and unprofessional. Furthermore, they did not believe the explanation provided by the Thai authorities. To them, the idea that a bad batch of beach drinks had killed their daughters while the two men survived simply did not make sense. They also questioned why there were no warnings about these deadly drinks if they were indeed causing fatalities on the beaches. They suspected that the Thai authorities were conducting a lazy investigation or trying to cover up a larger safety issue to protect the island's tourism industry, which was a vital source of revenue for the country. The Canadian government shared the family's concerns. The case had generated massive public interest and outcry in Canada, and officials felt that a more thorough investigation was required. They instructed René Roussel, a highly respected coroner in Quebec, to conduct a second independent autopsy and forensic review of the girls' remains. René carefully examined Noemi and Audrey's bodies, studying the tissue samples and reviewing the toxicological data. She did confirm the presence of DE in their systems, proving that they had indeed consumed the local beach drinks. But then, she made a critical discovery that completely shattered the Thai police's theory. The level of DE in the girls' bodies was far too low to be lethal. It was a minor concentration that might have caused mild nausea or a headache, but it absolutely could not have caused their deaths, let alone the severe vascular damage indicated by the blood on their gums and under their fingernails. René searched for other common poisons, heavy metals, and drugs, but found nothing. She knew she was missing something. She began to look deeper, researching other mysterious tourist deaths in Thailand. What she uncovered was a horrifying and silent epidemic. Between 2009 and 2015, at least 20 other young tourists, mostly women, had died in various Thai hotels under almost identical circumstances. In each of these cases, the victims were found dead in their beds, surrounded by vomit. They had all shown signs of dried blood on their gums and under their fingernails. The local authorities had attributed these deaths to natural causes, heart failure, or food poisoning, and had quickly closed the cases. But René realized that these were not random coincidences. There was a common thread linking all of these deaths, and it was not food or drink. René consulted with toxicologists, chemical experts, and international health organizations. She focused on the symptoms: rapid onset of illness, severe vomiting, vascular leakage leading to bleeding from the gums and nail beds, and a rapid death that left no traceable chemical footprint in the blood after a short period. Finally, she identified the suspect, phosphine gas. Phosphine gas is a highly toxic, colorless, and odorless gas that is generated from metal phosphides, such as aluminum phosphide. It is commonly used as a pesticide and fumigant to eliminate severe insect infestations, particularly bedbugs, in agricultural and commercial settings. It is incredibly effective at killing pests, but it is also highly lethal to humans. Because of its extreme toxicity, its use in residential areas, hotels, or any place where humans sleep is strictly prohibited by international safety standards and local laws. But Renee discovered that some budget hotels and guest houses in tourist areas secretly and illegally used this cheap, highly effective chemical to treat their rooms for bedbugs. When the pesticide is applied, it reacts with moisture in the air or sweat to slowly release phosphine gas. If a room is not properly ventilated for days after treatment, the gas accumulates in deadly concentrations, soaking into the mattress, sheets, and pillows. The tragic reality of what happened to Naomi and Audrey finally became clear. When they checked into room 47 on the evening of June 12th, Naomi had pulled back the sheets to check for bedbugs. She saw nothing because the room had recently been treated with the highly toxic chemical which had successfully killed any pests. But the invisible, odorless gas was still trapped in the fabric of the mattress and sheets. When the sisters and their Brazilian friends returned to the room later that night and climbed into the beds, their body heat and sweat accelerated the release of the phosphine gas. As they lay in the beds, they were constantly breathing in the toxic fumes, and the poison was being absorbed directly through their skin. The two Brazilian men left the room at 6 a.m, meaning they were only exposed to the gas for a few hours. This limited exposure was not enough to kill them, but it was enough to make them violently ill for the next 2 days, which explained their severe symptoms. Naomi and Audrey, however, remained in those beds. Already feeling exhausted and unwell, they stayed asleep for hours, deeply inhaling the concentrated gas. As the poison entered their lungs and bloodstreams, it began to damage their cell membranes and blood vessels, leading to internal bleeding. It paralyzed their muscles, making them too weak to move, scream, or call for help. They lay there completely helpless as their vital organs slowly shut down, leading to a tragic, silent death. Despite the overwhelming scientific evidence presented by Renee Rousel and the Canadian authorities, the hotel owners and local Thai officials denied any wrongdoing. No criminal charges were ever filed, and no one was held accountable for the deaths of Naomi and Audrey Bellener or the many other tourists who lost their lives to this silent killer. The family was left with a lifetime of grief, knowing that their beautiful daughters' lives were cut short by greed and negligence, and that justice would likely never be served. To this day, the story of Naomi and Audrey remains a heartbreaking reminder of the hidden dangers that travelers can face. It is a tragedy that highlights the importance of international safety standards and the need for accountability in the tourism industry. The family continues to share their story in the hope that it will raise awareness and prevent other families from enduring the same devastating loss. They want travelers to be aware of the risks and to always demand safe, healthy environments wherever they go. The memory of the two sisters lives on in the hearts of those who love them, a beautiful reminder of their bright spirits, their love for adventure, and the deep bond they shared. The impact of their loss is felt not only by their family, but also by the wider community in Quebec, where they were known as kind, hardworking, and full of life. Their classmates and friends remember them as young women who had so much potential and so many dreams for the future. The silence from the authorities and the lack of legal consequences have left a lingering sense of injustice, but the determination of their family and the work of Renee Rousel have ensured that the truth about what happened in Room 47 is known to the world. Their tragic end serves as a warning, but their lives are remembered for the joy and love they brought to everyone around them. As we look back on this case, we are reminded of the fragility of life and the importance of seeking the truth even when faced with official resistance. The memory of Naomi and Audrey will always be associated with their love for travel and their sisterly devotion. They explored the world together, and in the end, they remained together. Their story is one of love, adventure, and a tragic, unnecessary loss that should never have happened. We can only hope that by remembering them, we can contribute to a safer world for all travelers. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the evening of the 28th of December 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt was driving his truck down a highway heading into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The lights of the city were just beginning to glow against the darkening desert sky. Next to him, his 11-year-old daughter Sienna was fast asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. They had been on the road for nearly 12 hours, a long, quiet drive all the way from his mother's home in California. They had just spent Christmas there. But it hadn't really been a very happy holiday. A few weeks earlier, Don's sister Janice had passed away from breast cancer. And Janice was one of the last truly close family members Don had left. His father was gone, his other sister was gone too, and he wasn't even on speaking terms with his younger brother, Dennis. They'd had a huge argument the year before, and things had never been the same. So when Don got the news about Janice, he knew he had to be with his mom. He immediately called his ex-wife and arranged to take Sienna with him for the trip. He really wished they could have stayed in California a little longer, but he had to get back to work. Don worked at an agency that provided services for people who were developmentally disabled, and there was a big, important meeting coming up that he just could not miss. His job was important to him. It was a way of giving back, of doing good in the world, something he had come to value more and more over the years. Just then, the brake lights of the car in front of him flashed bright red. Don slammed on his own brakes, bringing the truck to a sudden stop. Traffic was piling up, everything grinding to a halt for no apparent reason. He felt that old, familiar surge of anger rise up in his chest. It was a hot, prickly feeling he knew all too well. He laid on the horn, a long, frustrated blast. He was just about to roll down the window to yell something at the driver in front of him, but then he glanced over at Sienna. She had opened her eyes, startled by the sudden stop and the noise. Seeing the alarm on her face was enough to make him stop. He took a deep breath. He reminded himself that it was just traffic. It wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have a pretty bad temper when he was behind the wheel, a real case of road rage. But in recent years, he'd been working really hard to control it. He wanted to set a better example for his daughter. So he just sat there, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for the traffic to move. Finally, the cars ahead started to inch forward. As he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through the familiar streets of downtown Albuquerque, Don made a conscious effort to shift his focus to something positive. He thought about the upcoming weekend. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And the thought of Spaghetti Sunday always made Don smile. It was a tradition he and Sienna had started together a few years back. Every Sunday, right after church, they would go home and cook up huge batches of spaghetti and meatballs. Then they'd pack it all up and take it downtown to feed the homeless community. At first, it had just been the two of them, a father and daughter with a big pot of pasta. But over time, word had spread. More people had started to join in, bringing their own food or dropping off donations of clothes and canned goods. Before long, it had grown into a real community event, with whole groups of volunteers showing up every week. Don was so proud of what he'd created, but he was especially proud that he had done it with Sienna, teaching her the importance of kindness and compassion. Finally, Don turned down his own quiet residential street. He pulled into the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse. It was still decorated with Christmas lights, their cheerful colors a little out of place with the sadness he was feeling. He turned off the engine, and the garage fell silent. He got out of the car, woke Sienna up gently, and then grabbed their suitcases from the back. They walked to the front door, and he fumbled for his keys in his pocket. He unlocked the door, and as his daughter stepped inside, she let out a huge shriek of pure excitement. Don smiled. Waiting for her right there under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle, a shiny bow tied to the handlebars. She spun around, her eyes wide, and asked if she could please take it for a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes. He loved seeing her so happy. But it was already dark outside, and this was only supposed to be a quick stop. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 o'clock. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday week, and he was supposed to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a civil relationship for the most part, but he knew she'd be annoyed if he was late or if he tried to ask for more time. They had a schedule, and it was important to stick to it. So, Don told Sienna the bike would have to wait. He promised they could ride it all weekend. For now, he just needed her to go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would head out. As Sienna ran upstairs, Don noticed something strange. His golden retriever, Buddy, hadn't come to greet him. Normally, the dog would be all over him, tail wagging, jumping up the second he heard the key in the door. It was unusual. So, Don walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name. He finally found the dog cowering in the master bedroom, tucked away in a corner. Don extended his hand, and Buddy came forward, but he was skittish, sniffing his hand cautiously. This was really unnerving for Don. Buddy never acted scared of him. But then again, Don had been gone for a while. He told himself it was probably just separation anxiety. The dog missed him. So, he gave Buddy a gentle pat on the head, made sure his bowl was full of kibble, and then grabbed his keys again. It was time for the short drive over to Christine's house. Don drove very slowly through the neighborhood, trying to savor every last minute with Sienna. He treasured this time with his daughter more than anything. The mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost cost him the chance to be her father. These days, Don lived a squeaky clean life. He went to church every Sunday, he ran his charity, he was a pillar of the community. But it hadn't always been that way. He had partied a lot in his youth. When Sienna was just a toddler, he'd had his dream job as a firefighter, but he'd lost it after failing a drug test. After he lost that job, the financial strain on his marriage to Christine became too much. She had to shoulder most of the bills, and the resentment built up. After a few months, Christine filed for divorce. It was a crushing blow for Don. But what was even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Don already had 2 older kids from a previous marriage. After that divorce, his first wife had been given sole custody, and she had moved them all to Oklahoma. As a result, Don had barely seen them while they were growing up. It was one of the biggest regrets of his life. He was absolutely determined not to let that happen again with Sienna. So, he'd gone to court. He fought Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten ugly at times, really contentious, but in the end, it was worth it. Don made the most of every single moment he got to spend with his daughter. He was the dad who would braid her hair before school. He was the dad who would stay up late making elaborate costumes for her school plays. And on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he never, ever forgot to call her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Don pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway. Christine was already outside, standing by the front door with her arms crossed. As he got out of the car, she pointedly motioned to her watch. She was clearly annoyed that he was late. Don walked over and sort of apologized, explaining that it had been a really long drive from California. He told her they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and then they'd hit all that traffic coming into the city. Christine just sighed and said it was okay. She asked how the trip was, and Don told her it went as well as it could. They'd had a nice Christmas despite the sadness hanging over everything because of his sister's death. He said it had been meaningful just for the family to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Don pulled her in for a big hug and a kiss. He told her he loved her and promised to call her before bed, just like always. And he reminded her that when he saw her again that weekend, they would have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Don pulled back into his own garage just 10 minutes later, he noticed that the big plastic trash can at the end of his driveway was lying on its side, overturned. He figured the wind must have knocked it over. So he parked his truck, got out, and walked down to the curb to flip it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed the button on the wall to close the garage door, and unlocked the interior door that led into his townhouse. As he was inside, taking off his shoes and his jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing. He thought he heard it start to roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the safety sensor at the bottom. He paused, listening intently. And then what he heard was the sound of the door closing again, this time hitting the concrete floor with a soft thud. He shook his head. He must have been imagining things. He was tired from the long drive. His mind was playing tricks on him. Don dragged his suitcase into his bedroom and started to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and try not to think about anything for a while. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he looked up and saw a small, ugly hole in the ceiling. He let out a frustrated sigh. Don had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months. He had really been hoping it would finally be done by the time he got home. He made a mental note to give the landlord yet another angry call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Don put his jacket and his shoes back on. He headed out to the garage to have a cigarette before bed. It was his routine, a quiet moment to himself at the end of a long day. The following morning, on December 29th, at the office where Don worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk with a cup of coffee when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up. It was Don's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna sounded worried. She told Valerie that her dad hadn't called her last night to say goodnight. She asked if he was there at the office now. Valerie stood up and peered over the cubicle wall at Don's desk. It was empty. His computer was off. This was a little unusual. Don was a very punctual guy. He was always one of the first people in the office. But it was still early. So she told Sienna not to worry. She said she would give Don a call right now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back as soon as he got the message. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. That was also strange. So she sent him a text message, just asking if everything was okay. She waited. But after half an hour, Don still hadn't replied. He hadn't shown up at the office either. And now, Valerie was starting to feel a real sense of concern. It was not like Don to just skip work without calling in. And it was definitely not like him to ignore calls and texts, especially if he knew his daughter was trying to reach him. Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they both agreed that something felt wrong. They decided to just go swing by Don's townhouse themselves and check on him. Maybe he had just overslept, or maybe his phone had died. They hoped it was something simple. The sky over Don's townhouse was dark and cloudy as Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked, but to her surprise, the door just swung open under the pressure of her hand. It hadn't been latched properly. She looked over at her coworker, a nervous expression on her face. Then the two of them cautiously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Don's name, but there was no answer. The house was quiet. So she started to wander through the living room, peeking into the bedroom on the first floor. The house seemed empty. Her coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Don on the second floor. Valerie decided she would check the garage to see if maybe Don's truck was there. If the truck was gone, maybe he just had an early morning appointment he forgot to mention. Valerie opened the door that led from the kitchen into the two-car garage. She flipped on the light switch. The fluorescent bulbs flickered on, and she saw Don's truck parked in its usual spot. But as her eyes scanned the garage, something else caught her attention. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV that also parked in the shared space, she noticed a streak of something dark red. It ran down the wall. At this point, Valerie's heart started to pound in her chest. She was feeling pretty nervous, but she knew she had to see what it was. She began walking slowly toward that back wall, her eyes fixed on the dark streak. She was wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her, if it was just paint or rust. As she got closer and closer, the streak came into sharper focus. Finally, she was close enough that she could actually look down into the narrow space between the back of the SUV and that red-streaked wall. And when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, an Albuquerque police detective named Matthew Kaplan pulled his unmarked car up in front of a 2-story stucco townhouse. The whole property was already secured with yellow crime scene tape, and police officers were swarming the area. 2 women in business clothes were sitting on the curb, their faces stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew so far was that a man had been found dead in the garage attached to this townhouse. And now he was the lead investigator on the case. So he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door. A uniformed officer standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more of the details. The victim had been identified as Dawn Fluitt. The 2 women sitting outside were his coworkers. They had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. The officer also told him there were no signs of forced entry. The women had said the front door was unlocked, just slightly ajar when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse, into the living room. The first thing he saw was a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. It looked like it hadn't even been ridden yet. Then he did a slow, methodical loop through the first and second floors. He noted there was a cell phone lying on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter full of cash and credit cards. It didn't look like anything had been rifled through. None of the drawers in the house were hanging open. The place was generally neat and orderly. On first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan to be a robbery gone wrong. Back on the first floor, Kaplan pushed open the door to the garage. Crime scene techs were already busy inside, their cameras flashing as they photographed the scene and collected forensic samples. Kaplan carefully stepped around them and knelt down next to Dawn's body. It was lying face up, wedged in the small space between an SUV and the back wall. Dawn's throat had been cut. It was a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other. There were also smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, on his ear, and on his hands, defensive wounds, as if he had tried to fight back against his attacker. There were also clear signs of blunt force trauma to his head, as if he had been hit repeatedly with a heavy object, something like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked very closely at Dawn's eyes, he saw tiny red dots, burst capillaries on his eyeballs and eyelids. He knew from experience that these were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent, almost overkill. It was gruesome. And Kaplan knew that kind of rage usually meant the murder was personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the rest of the scene. There was blood spattered on the walls and on a small refrigerator that stood next to the body. There were also bloody handprints smeared on the side of Dawn's own truck. But there was no large pool of blood on the concrete floor around Dawn's body. In fact, the floor looked strangely clean. It looked like somebody had recently mopped it, like they had tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty plastic bottle of bleach sitting on top of the washing machine nearby. His eyes narrowed. He walked over, he opened up the lid of the washer, and sure enough, he found a pile of wet towels inside. They still smelled strongly of bleach. The killer had stayed. They had taken the time to try and clean the scene. Just then, a crime scene tech came over, carrying a bottle of luminol spray. Luminol is a chemical that law enforcement uses to detect trace amounts of blood even after it's been cleaned up. It reacts with the iron in hemoglobin and glows a faint blue in the dark. Kaplan stepped back so the tech could spray the area. He followed him as he made his way through the garage and then back into the house. The luminol spray did indeed pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and inside the kitchen sink. Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage, and then they had come inside to wash their hands, or maybe even the murder weapon, in the kitchen sink before they left. But it's much, much harder to completely scrub a murder scene than most people realize. And so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually be able to recover some of the killer's DNA from the scene. Kaplan stepped out through the front door just as another car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car, looking agitated, He pushed right past the yellow crime scene tape, and Kaplan immediately put his hands up to stop him. The man looked totally flustered. He introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord. He asked what on earth the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Don Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped. Then he started talking a mile a minute. He said Don was a devoted father, a deeply religious man who would open up his home to anyone. He said that nobody would ever want to kill Don. But then Benny paused. He made a face, like a thought was just occurring to him. And he said that, actually, there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Don did a lot of charity work with the city's homeless population. And he said it was possible that maybe somebody from the street could have followed Don home, broken into his house, and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny and sent him on his way, he just stood on Don's driveway, thinking about what the landlord had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder and the fact that nothing of value appeared to have been stolen, he doubted very much that this was just a random break-in by a homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Don's killer was someone Don knew. Maybe even someone who had a key to the house, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Don was a big, muscular guy, and it was clear from the defensive wounds that he had fought back hard against his attacker, Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially large male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Don Fluitt? From what the landlord and the two coworkers had said, Don seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan drove to the house of Don's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had already spoken to Christine on the phone the day before, just to break the terrible news about her ex-husband's death and to see if she had any idea who might have done this. Christine hadn't had any specific ideas about who would want to hurt Don, but she had mentioned that he used to have a big problem with road rage. She pointed out that he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so maybe, she suggested, he had gotten into some kind of confrontation with another driver on the highway, and maybe they had gotten angry enough to follow him home. But she also said their daughter Sienna had been with him for the whole drive, and Sienna hadn't mentioned anything like that happening. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Don had told her his dog Buddy was acting really skittish and scared when he had gotten back from the road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine herself as a suspect. She had an airtight alibi. Don had dropped Sienna off at her house around 7:45 on the night he was killed, and Christine and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together, at home. Her road rage theory seemed about as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but it wasn't particularly helpful in identifying a suspect right now. But Kaplan was back at Christine's house today because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry. Terry had been out of town for work the night before. He was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Don's ex-wife, he was a natural person of interest. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite, easy smile. Kaplan entered the living room where Christine and Sienna were sitting. He said a quick hello to them and then asked if they could leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in a big armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed very calm, almost relaxed, and he was friendly as he told the detective that he and Don didn't really have much contact with each other. He said their relationship wasn't exactly bad, it was just awkward. He explained it was because of the very difficult custody battle Don had had with Christine a few years back. Ever since then, Terry said he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Don as much as possible. He said he knew that Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked some kind of conflict with Don, Sienna would likely take her dad's side, and he didn't want that. As for the night of Don's murder, Terry told Kaplan that he was at his sister's house until about 9 o'clock that evening. Then he left her place and stopped at a Wendy's on his way to work to grab a burger. After that, he said he took a nap in the cab of his truck in the company parking lot before going in for his overnight shift. After Kaplan left Terry and Christine's house, he went back to the station. He immediately called Terry's sister, and then he called Terry's boss at the trucking company. And they both confirmed Terry's story. His sister said he left her house around 9. His boss confirmed he clocked in for his shift later that night. It seemed that Terry's alibi was solid, and that meant Kaplan was right back to square one with no viable suspects. But while he was sitting at his desk, writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang. It was a call from one of Dawn's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her home security camera for the night of Dawn's murder, and she had found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence. He grabbed his keys and drove right over to the neighbor's house. She led him inside to her computer and pressed play on a video file. Kaplan leaned in close to the computer screen. He watched the grainy black and white footage. The camera was mounted on her house, and it showed the side of Dawn's townhouse shot from the top of her driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., which Kaplan knew was just a few minutes after Dawn and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a dark, hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure walked over and deliberately tipped over Dawn's trash can. Then the figure walked up the driveway toward Dawn's garage and disappeared from the screen, presumably hiding somewhere out of view. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Dawn's truck pulling into the garage. Then it showed Dawn walking back out again to go pick up the overturned trash can. He set it upright, and then he walked back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in the camera's frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Dawn's garage. Kaplan could see that light start to dim, which meant the garage door was closing. But then, inexplicably, the light began to get bigger again, which meant the door must have started going back up. And at the exact same time, there were several brief flashes of light, like a strobe. And then, after those flashes, the light began to dim again, meaning the garage door finally closed all the way, eventually leaving the driveway in total darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video from the neighbor. Then he left her house and walked over to Dawn's, trying to piece together what he had just seen on that video. He stood inside of Dawn's empty garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand. He pressed the button to close the door. And as the heavy door began its descent, Kaplan walked closer and closer until he was standing almost directly underneath its path. And when he did that, all of a sudden, the door stopped. Kaplan had tripped the infrared safety sensor at the bottom. And as soon as he tripped that sensor, a light on the motor unit at the top of the garage flashed 3 times, just as the door not only stopped, but reversed direction and began going back up. It was clearly the system's safety feature. And once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he had seen in the neighbor's video. And he thought about that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage just moments before Dawn got home. And all at once, it was like the pieces of the puzzle just clicked into place. The suspect must have waited for Dawn to go inside. And then, as the garage door was closing, they must have tried to sneak into the garage. But when they did, they must have tripped that sensor. So, the door would have stopped, those lights would have flashed, and the door would have started to go back up again. But the suspect, not wanting Dawn to realize what was going on, must have rushed over to the control panel on the wall and quickly hit the button again to make the door shut all the way. It was a close call for the killer. And it meant Dawn was none the wiser that someone else was now in the garage with him. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage was, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on the security video. It was too grainy and the person was wearing a hood. But the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Dawn must have known his routine. They must have known when he would be leaving to take Sienna to her mother's house, and they must have known approximately when he would be coming back home alone. And they also must have known that Dawn was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, wouldn't just ignore it and leave it for the morning. They knew he would deal with it right then and there. And while Dawn was down at the curb, busy with the trash can, that would give the killer the perfect opportunity to sneak into the garage undetected. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Don, they had to have known him very, very well. Detective Kaplan spent the next several weeks speaking to absolutely everyone who knew Don. He talked to his coworkers, his friends from church, and his entire extended family. He even tracked down his first wife and the 2 kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said that they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad over the years. However, they said that wasn't true for some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan that the person he should really be investigating was Don's own brother, Dennis. They said that Don and Dennis had had a huge falling out about a year earlier. But somehow, right after Don's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Don's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over all of Don's affairs ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the rest of the family that he was just trying to be helpful. But Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January of 2017, nearly a month after Don was murdered, Detective Kaplan brought Don's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. Seated across the bare interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up. He was fidgety, but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or just irritated about it because he was innocent and being hassled. Dennis told Kaplan that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015, a little over a year earlier. He said the family had reached an agreement about what to do with their dad's possessions. But Don had apparently violated that agreement by keeping one of their father's classic cars for himself instead of selling it and splitting the money like they had all agreed. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said he and Don were no longer on speaking terms at all. Dennis claimed that he had reached out to Don that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Don never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that at some point they could patch things up if they just tried a little bit harder. But then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Don was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished his explanation. He didn't really buy the whole reconciliation story. And Dennis's only alibi for the night of the murder was that he was home alone. That wasn't an alibi at all. So, Kaplan decided to push him a little harder. He asked Dennis why he had started rooting through Don's house the very minute the crime scene tape came down. At this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to go through his brother's things themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Don's affairs had actually led him to a new lead about the murder, a lead that he wanted Kaplan to look into. He said that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Don's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, just standing there inside, with no good explanation for what he was doing. Dennis said he had heard from Don's neighbors that Don and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole in the ceiling that the landlord was supposed to repair, but hadn't gotten around to yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into an active crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair. He remembered Benny Ruiz showing up at the house on the day Don's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence at all, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Don. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself from the very beginning. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz, the landlord, into the station for an interview. Just like Don's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Don was killed. He said he was at home. But he did have an explanation for why Dennis had found him inside of Don's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed Don's dog Buddy because nobody else was looking after the poor animal during the first few chaotic days following Don's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there was one person he should really be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived from out of town, he had been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse just a few blocks away from Don's. And Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it. He said he wanted to move some of Don's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this whole thing very strange. When he ran a routine background check on Dennis, he discovered that he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no, he couldn't rent the place. Now, Kaplan already knew about Dennis's criminal record because he had run his name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of complete estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in taking over his brother's life and raising his daughter. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer. But there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Don Fluitt as a loving father and a man of faith, a man who had completely reformed himself after some serious mistakes in his youth, appeared to be completely accurate. Don's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with him over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off years ago. And both she and her new husband, Terry, had alibis that seemed to check out. Don also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. There just didn't seem to be anybody in his life who truly wanted Don dead. In February, about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article about the case. The headline said that the police had no suspects and no solid evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit to himself that it was more or less the truth. The investigation had hit a wall. The breakthrough that Detective Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, a full 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the state forensics lab. They told him that the results from a key piece of evidence had just come in, and the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on all the forensic evidence, the dozens of interviews, and the police investigation, here is what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of the 28th of December 2016. The killer waited in the darkness, right outside of Don's house, until the garage door opened at about 7:40 in the evening. At that point, Don drove off with his daughter Sienna in the truck. And as soon as they were gone, the killer darted forward, tipped over the heavy plastic garbage can at the end of the driveway, and then retreated back into the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Don for a very long time. It annoyed them that everyone in town seemed to think that Don was so great that he was some kind of saint. Because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been a drug-abusing loser with 2 older kids that he didn't even seem to care for, and another one, Sienna, who he deserved to lose. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. So, the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it. But finally, they had had enough. Don was just a dark cloud, constantly hovering over their life, and he had to go. The killer knew Don well enough to have his schedule figured out. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's house that evening. They knew he'd be coming home alone after that. And they knew that before he went to bed, he would almost always go out into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand. It's a small, heavy wooden bat that truckers use to check their tire pressure. And as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 o'clock, Don's truck came down the street. He pulled into the garage. And just as the killer had planned, while Don was out at the curb fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind the neighbor's SUV, as Don walked back up the driveway and pressed the button to close the garage door, and then went inside his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into a better position to ambush Don. And as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door's safety sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those little lights flashing. Thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to force the garage door to close. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement from inside the townhouse that would suggest Don had heard the noise and was coming out to check. But Don didn't seem to notice. The killer breathed out a quiet sigh of relief and took their position near the interior door, waiting in the dark. After a while, the doorknob jiggled. The killer realized this was it. they raised their weapon. And as soon as Don opened the door and stepped into the garage, they struck him in the head so hard that the wooden tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Don again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage and resentment they had been pushing down for so long. Don did everything he could to fight back. He was a strong man, and he was fighting for his life. He had turned his whole life around. He had a daughter that he loved more than anything, a daughter he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here in his garage. And so, as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer, scratching and clawing. But he had been gravely injured in the initial attack. And when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck to hide. But the killer was relentless. They pulled him out and landed one last brutal punch to his face. Don stopped moving. And at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat, and they squeezed and squeezed until he went limp. But the killer still wasn't done. To make absolutely sure that Don was dead, they went back into Don's apartment, they grabbed a large knife from a butcher block in the kitchen, and they came back into the garage. They knelt down next to Don's body and ruthlessly slit his throat. Blood ran out of the wound and began to pool on the concrete floor. The killer then found some bleach under the sink inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could. But in their haste, they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Don was not able to save his own life that night. But by aggressively fighting back against his attacker, he had given investigators the one clue that would eventually solve his murder. And he would also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Sienna would be able to grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind, the evidence that solved the entire case, was a tiny speck of DNA found under Don's fingernails. And that DNA belonged to none other than Sienna's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's house until 9 o'clock that night was a lie. His sister had covered for him. And so on the 3rd of April 2017, just over 3 months after Don's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. After his arrest, Terry tried to cast blame on his wife, Christine, Don's ex-wife. He claimed that she was the one who had put him up to it, that she had manipulated him into killing Don so that they could have Sienna all to themselves and stop dealing with the custody arrangement. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder. But the charges against her were eventually dropped due to a complete lack of evidence. There was nothing to tie her to the crime except the word of her killer husband. Terry White, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus an additional 12 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.